Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. Last week, we got lost in a maze of tangents not unlike the Midnight Forest of Nan Elmoth. We discussed the failures of wisdom among the elves of Beleriand. We discussed the restless spirit of Arathel and her eventual and, let's say, dubious marriage to Eol the Dark Elf, followed, of course, by the birth of their son Maeglin the Sharp-Eyed, who was raised on stories of Gondolin and really raised on stories of the precarious succession of Turgon's throne. Maeglin, whose words are so compelling that he can sell rubble to the dwarves, eventually persuades his mother to leave the darkness of Eol's kingdom, and she's all, sure, I don't know why I left Gondolin in the first place. So we should go back, right? We should go back. They leave Nan Elmoth and race back to Gondolin, but Eol follows after and runs into Curufin, the Feanorist son of Feanor, and then they face off against one another on the plains of Himlad. This week, we are finishing up Chapter 16, completing the story of Arathel and Eol and setting Maeglin safely on his path. And then we're going to change gears and we're going to look at the arrival of men in Beleriand and the first friendship with the elves in Chapter 17, and the first strife with the elves, the first discord with the elves, and a really great and under-celebrated character who we'll get to hopefully near the end of this week's reading. Before we get to all of that, though, I want to have a brief discussion of Arathel. I had a conversation this week with listener Richard, hello Richard, who was eager to, Richard was extremely kind in his email, so I want to very carefully formulate how this is presented. Richard was eager to rebalance what he perceived as my critique of Arathel's restlessness by suggesting that Maeglin, in that crucial discussion that they have in the Forest of Nan Elmoth, in Eol's realm there, that Maeglin was actually manipulating his mother. We have this quote, we're told, his words were few save in matters that touched him near, and then his voice had a power to move those that hurt him and to overthrow those that withstood him. And the narrative explicitly tells us, of course, that Maeglin is planning to, quote, wheedle the secret from her, or perhaps to read her unguarded mind. The secret there, of course, being the means of getting to the hidden city of Gondolin. So, do we see Maeglin working on his mother's mind in much the same way as the ring works on the minds of those near it in The Lord of the Rings, right? A phenomenon that we've discussed a great deal back when we were discussing The Lord of the Rings over on the show There and Back Again. Well, maybe. I don't think that Arathel's renewed restlessness is completely attributable to Maeglin, because it is when she is telling her son the stories of Gondolin that she remembers how great the city was. We don't get any sense there that Maeglin is interrupting the storytelling, that Maeglin is kind of inserting himself into the narrative that his mother is spinning for him, rather that she is moved by the stories themselves, and that this active memory of the beauty of the hidden city of Gondolin is what stirs her, what rekindles that desire, right? This is the quote. A desire to see her own kin again, and she marveled that she had grown weary of the light of Gondolin and the fountains in the sun and the green sward of Tumladen under the windy skies of spring. So the change of heart seems to come from Arathel herself, though I will admit that perhaps reading it as restlessness is more harsh, than she deserves. Perhaps, right? There is a way that you can definitely read it as wisdom, that she left Gondolin as a much younger elf, not much younger because it's only been a couple hundred years and she's like 1400 years old, but she left Gondolin because she didn't understand how special it was, and now she understands how special it is and she wants to go home. You can read it that way if you want to. For me, the problem with that reading is simply the word marveled, that she herself does not understand her process, that it is still inscrutable, that it is still opaque to her, that she doesn't understand that this is her restlessness manifesting itself. If it were wisdom, I would not expect to find the word marveled there, or at least I would expect more explanation, right? Understanding now that she had left behind the safety and the peace and the love of her kin in Gondolin, Arathel resolved to return. We don't get that. She doesn't understand. She marvels at it. She doesn't understand what it was that drove her from that place originally and led her all the way to Nan Elmoth, and, as I say, her dubious reconnection here with Eol, her first connection, I suppose, with Eol. So I'm not 100% sure that I side with Richard on this reading, but I do think that the actual moment of departure, that moment of departure from Nan Elmoth, is a little different. We have, let me call it up here. Yes, let me call up the slide here that contains this dialogue from last week's reading. Quote, "It came to pass that at the midsummer the dwarves, as was their custom, bade Eol to feast in Nogrod, and he rode away. Now Maeglin and his mother were free for a while to go where they wished, and they rode often to the eaves of the wood, seeking the sunlight. And desire grew hot in Maeglin's heart to leave Nan Elmoth forever. Therefore he said to Arathel, Lady, let us depart while there is time. What hope is there in this wood for you or for me? Here we are held in bondage, and no profit shall I find here. For I have learned all that my father has to teach, or that the Naugrim will reveal to me. Shall we not seek for Gondolin? You shall be my guide, and I will be your guard." Then Arathel was glad, and looked with pride upon her son, and telling the servants of Eol that they went to seek the sons of Fëanor, they departed and rode away to the north eaves of Nan Elmoth. There they crossed the slender stream of Callan into the land of Himlad, and rode on to the fords of Aros, and so westward along the fences of Doriath. So maybe there's something happening here. We're told with this immediacy, this unusual immediacy, that she feels gladness and pride, and they go right there and then, despite the fact that, as we discussed last week, there's no mechanism for divorce in Elven custom, right? There's no social mechanism that she can fall back on here. This is a very serious thing, almost an unprecedented thing, not to suggest that elves cannot live apart. They certainly do. They certainly can. They're more autonomous even in marriage than perhaps men are, certainly than we are in the real world. I think it's generally quite surprising if you live apart from the person to whom you are betrothed, or to whom you're even fully married, come to that. So it's a little surprising that she just agrees to go immediately. And what's perhaps even more important, later when Eol shows up in Gondolin, she's going to say that she's afraid that he would follow after, but there's no trace of that here. And I find that both interesting and, yes, I think a possible proof that Maeglin has here in this only line of attributed dialogue that we get in the entire chapter, that he has in fact overthrown his mother. I would be wary, I would say, I would be wary to credit Maeglin's ability to any kind of magic or power here. I'm not sure that we're supposed to understand that this is a conscious thing that Maeglin is doing. We're certainly not, I would say, supposed to understand this as being like the manifestation of his X-Men superpower. Like, he's not the Purple Man from Marvel Comics, of course. There's something else happening here. It is just a force of rhetoric almost as much as it is a force of will. The skills that we attribute to the elves, we're going to get an opportunity to talk about this quite extensively tonight when we finally reach the men coming into the West. We'll talk a little perhaps there about the special abilities that some elves seem to have that generally go unnoticed and unregarded. So yes, I don't know. I think that maybe we can read this as a manipulation of Arathel by Maeglin. And if we are to read it that way, then Maeglin has to bear additional responsibility for everything that comes thereafter, which we'll get into right now, in fact, by picking up with Eol in Himlad, leaving the taunts of Curufin behind. Remembering, of course, that I didn't really stress this as much as I should last week, because we're going to be navigating civility and decency and certainly courtesy through the rest of this chapter. And it is important that Eol greets Curufin initially with courtesy, not an excess of courtesy, right? He's not deferent in any real and substantial way, but he is at least, observing the general courtesies of their encounter, and it is Curufin that absolutely casts that away. It is Curufin that even casts doubt on the validity, on the legitimacy of Eol's marriage to Arathel in the first place, because those customs of the Eldar have not been observed, because there was no betrothal price, for example, for Arathel. So it immediately gets spiky in their confrontation there, and that is only going to be, well, echoed, but also inverted by the time that we get to the court in Gondolin itself. Let's pick up then with the race back to Gondolin. Let me show you this slide, and we'll progress. Then Eol rode off in haste, and he was filled with hatred of all the Noldor, for he perceived now that Maeglin and Arathel were fleeing to Gondolin. And driven by anger and the shame of his humiliation, he crossed the fords of Aros and rode hard upon the way that they had gone before. But though they knew not that he followed them, and he had the swiftest steed, he came never in sight of them until they reached the Brithiath and abandoned their horses. Then by ill fate they were betrayed, for the horses neighed loudly, and Eol's steed heard them and sped toward them. And Eol saw from afar the white raiment of Arathel, and marked which way she went, seeking the secret path into the mountains. Now Arathel and Maeglin came to the outer gate of Gondolin and the dark guard under the mountains, and there she was received with joy. And passing through the 7 gates, she came with Maeglin, to Turgon upon Amon Gwareth. Then the king listened with wonder to all that Arathel had to tell, and he looked with liking upon Maeglin, his sister's son, seeing in him one worthy to be accounted among the princes of the Noldor. I rejoice indeed that our Finiel has returned to Gondolin, he said, and now more fair again shall my city seem than in the days when I deemed her lost, and Maeglin shall have the highest honour in my realm. In the first part of Unfinished Tales, we are told a little more about the gates of Gondolin, and I don't generally want to pull out from the Silmarillion too much to go and talk about the other works written by Professor Tolkien, compiled by Christopher Tolkien. But this accounting in the first part of the Unfinished Tales is just extraordinary. It takes like 8 pages to cover what we cover here in, 2 lines, a line even in the Silmarillion itself, and it is just fantastic. The 7 gates here that we're told, the gate of wood, followed by the gate of stone, the gate of bronze, the gate of writhen iron, that is, writhen is Middle English to turn and twist about. It's where we get the word writhe, of course. It's also where we get the word wreath, right? So this carved, twisted iron gate, the gate of silver, the gate of gold, and the gate of steel. It is fantastic, and the progression of Tuor and Veronwe through all the many gates of Gondolin are just wonderful. The Dark Gate, as is noted here in the Silmarillion, is the Wood Gate. It's the first gate on the path to Gondolin. And if you're having trouble conceptualizing Gondolin, if you're having trouble kind of really picturing what it looks like and the scales involved, absolutely go and read the beginning of Unfinished Tales. The whole excerpt is maybe 12 pages, maybe 14 pages. It is excellent and will really give you a sense of what Gondolin is, not just where it is and the geography of the approach to the hidden city, though certainly it will give you that, but it will also, I think, give you a sense of the impact of the city on Tuor as he approaches it. It's a really, really wonderful piece. I should note here, too, the fords of Aros, the Rosiach and the Brithiach, the fords of the Syrian northeast and northwest of Doriath, respectively. So he's just crossing the rivers and dashing as far as he can. And, of course, we're tuned now, after all this time spent studying the works of Professor Tolkien, to pay attention to questions of fate, to these moments when something seems to intercede. Then by ill fate they were betrayed, for the horses neighed loudly, and Eowl's steed heard them and sped toward them. And then Eowl sees from afar the white raiment of Arathel, right? Arathel, the white lady of Gondolin, as we've noted before. So she's just still wearing her white clothes, her white robes, as they dash toward the secret path into the mountains. But the return here to Gondolin isn't as fractious as we might expect. It isn't. There doesn't seem to be any ill will between Turgon and his once lost sister, and maybe that's because, yes, absolutely, she departed kind of against his will, right? You'll remember that she was told that she could go with her escort. She then decided that she wanted to go see the Sons of Feanor regardless, and the escort had to turn back because they were facing the many spawn of Ungoliant. But it turns out that all is forgiven. When your sister returns after 200 years spent in Nan Elmoth, it turns out that everything's kind of okay. I guess it's not a full 200 years. What is it? It's about a century, right? Maeglin is about 80 years old at this point, so young for an elf, sure, but still pretty old. I'm unaccustomed, even at this point, to compressing the timeline of the Silmarillion so much. You know, I mentioned this back when we were talking about the creation of the sun and the moon. Actually, I think it's the chapter after. It's chapter 12. It's Of Men was the first time when we get the accounting of the years of the sun and this new temporal schematic that Tolkien presents us with. I noted how much we zoom in to the timeline, and here we are, right? We're coming up on the end of the book now, and we've spent less than 400 years after the creation of the sun and the moon. We're really, really tight in, and we're going to do it again as we progress into the second chapter of today's reading. As we talk about the coming of the men into the West, we're going to rewind 100 years. We're going to reset back to like 310 YS, I believe, is when the first men come into Beleriand from Middle-earth proper. We'll get, of course, to all of that. So Arathel has been gone, but now she is returned. I rejoice indeed that our Finiel has returned to Gondolin, he said, and now more fair again shall my city seem than in the days when I deemed her lost, and Maeglin shall have the highest honour in my realm. He immediately gets Maeglin, right? We're told that Maeglin kind of looks like a prince of the Noldor anyway, and he certainly seems to make a good first impression here, seeing in him one worthy to be accounted among the princes of the Noldor. So, how does Maeglin respond to this? Well, Maeglin inserts himself into the courtly life of Gondolin, of course. Then Maeglin bowed low and took Turgon for lord and king to do all his will. But thereafter he stood silent and watchful, for the bliss and splendor of Gondolin surpassed all that he had imagined from the tales of his mother. And he was amazed by the strength of the city and the hosts of its people, and the many things strange and beautiful that he beheld. Yet to none were his eyes more often drawn than to Idril, the king's daughter, who sat beside him, for she was golden as the Vanyar, his mother's kindred, and she seemed to him as the sun from which all the king's hall drew its light. But Eol, following after Arathal, found the dry river and the secret path, and so creeping in by stealth he came to the guard and was taken and questioned. And when the guard heard that, he claimed Arathal as wife. They were amazed, and sent a swift messenger to the city, and he came to the king's hall. "Lord," he cried, "the guard have taken captive one that came by stealth to the dark gate. Eol, he names himself, and he is a tall elf, dark and grim, of the kindred of the Sindar. Yet he claims the lady Arathel as his wife, and demands to be brought before you. His wrath is great, and he is hard to restrain, but we have not slain him as your law commands." Then Arathel said, "Alas, Eol has followed us even as I feared, but with great stealth was it done, for we saw and heard no pursuit as we entered upon the hidden way." Then she said to the messenger, "He speaks but the truth. He is Eol, and I am his wife, and he is the father of my son. Slay him not, but lead him hither to the king's judgment as the king so wills." So, Maeglin is immediately drawn to Idril, enchanted by her light, the light of Valinor, visible in the faces of the Calaquendi, of course, but her further light, the light of Elenwe of the Vanyar, her mother, right? The first order of the elves, led by Ingwe, who lived for a while in Tirion upon Tuna, but then moved to the foot of Taniquetil to be closer to Manwë and Varda. The Vanyar are the most pro-Valar part of the Calaquendi. They are the ones that are most in favor of living happily ever after in the Blessed Realm, right? they are the ones who have absolutely bought into the whole life in Valinor package deal, and they are more, therefore, affected by the light. They are the greatest of all of the Calaquendi, and now we're back. You'll remember when we're introduced to Idril in the first place, we're told that her hair is as the gold of Laurelin before the coming of Melkor, right? And if you are comparing anyone in the Silmarillion to the trees, if you are comparing anything in the Silmarillion to the trees of Valinor, then you are saying very clearly that they are among the highest order of beings. And that seems to be absolutely true of Idril, and Maeglin is somewhat overwhelmed, right? He immediately pledges his service, yes, as is appropriate, but he's kind of struck by Gondolin because the stories that his mother told, which so moved him, were insufficient, right? It's hard to communicate the splendor of Gondolin, the wonder of Gondolin, particularly within this fictional frame, because largely this is a book that is written for and read by people who have a kind of cultural understanding of Gondolin, right? The memory of Gondolin has not faded among the elves, so you don't have to take the time in the book to emphasize how wonderful it is, except for these fleeting moments when we get POV characters, when we get people introduced to Gondolin, even somewhat indirectly, like Maeglin, and we get a sense of how splendid it is, right? He was amazed by the strength of the city and the hosts of its people, the many things strange and beautiful that he beheld, yet to none were his eyes more often drawn than Idril, the king's daughter. That's probably going to be fine. Probably nothing bad is going to happen because of his fascination with his first cousin. So then we have the arrival of Eol at the gate and the guard breaking the rules, right? His wrath is great and he is hard to restrain, but we have not slain him as your law commands. We didn't kill him, right? Maybe, I love the ambiguity here, actually. Arathel seems to say, slay him not, but lead him hither to the king's judgment as the king so wills, right? Okay. Are the guards supposed to kill outright anyone who comes to the gate, or anyone who comes to the gate and claims kinship to, we have to remember that Arathel's sister of Turgon is effectively, a princess of Gondolin. We never really spend a lot of time on that kind of feudal familial power structure, because there's really no need for it when elves effectively live forever, right? We don't need to spend a lot for the same reason as we don't worry about divorce, for the same reason as we don't worry about remarriage, right? There are things about elven society which are fixed. There's not a great deal of social mobility there. So it's unclear, quite what the role of Arathel in Gondolin is, to the extent that she even has like a civil role or a what quasi-governmental role to fulfill here. But we also don't know what the rules are. His wrath is great and he is hard to restrain, but we have not slain him as your law commands. Does your law command that we slay him and we have not done that? Or does your law command that we do not slay him because we have done that? We have not slayed him per the law. I love that ambiguity. Let's keep pushing on then and see the confrontation and get to see, I think, something that has been missing a little bit in our reading so far, which is a little bit of the wisdom of Turgon the king here. And so it was done. And Eöl was brought to Turgon's hall and stood before his high seat, proud and sullen. Though he was amazed no less than his son at all he saw, his heart was filled the more with anger and with hate of the Noldor. But Turgon treated him with honor, and rose up and would take his hand, and he said, "Welcome, kinsman, for so I hold you. Here you shall dwell at your pleasure, save only that you must here abide and depart not from my kingdom, for it is my law that none who finds the way hither shall depart." But Eöl withdrew his hand. "I acknowledge not your law," he said. "No right have you or any of your kin in this land to seize realms or to set bounds either here or there. This is the land of the Teleri, to which you bring war and all unquiet, dealing ever proudly and unjustly. I care nothing for your secrets, and I came not to spy upon you, but to claim my own, my wife and my son. Yet if in Arathel your sister you have some claim, then let her remain. Let the bird go back to the cage, where she will soon sicken again, as she sickened before. But not so, Maeglin. My son you shall not withhold from me. Come, Maeglin, son of Eöl, your father commands you. Leave the house of his enemies and the slayers of his kin, or be accursed." But Maeglin answered nothing. Then Turgon sat in his high seat, holding his staff of doom, and in a stern voice spoke, "I will not debate with you, dark elf. By the swords of the Noldor alone are your sunless woods defended. Your freedom to wander there wild you owe to my kin. But for them long since you would have labored in thraldom in the pits of Angband. And here I am king. And whether you will it or will it not, my doom is law. This choice only is given to you, to abide here or to die here, and so also for your son." So initially, I think we get a really good perspective of Turgon, right? He is a good king. He is a wise king. Let's remember that his title, as recorded by the annals of history, is Turgon the Wise. But, crucially, he's still Noldori. He's still bound by the same doom as all his kin. He's still arrogant. He's still focused on the war against Morgoth, kind of defined by the war against Morgoth, by the oath that the sons of Feanor took, right? There's some typology happening here, obviously some familial dynamics, right? "By our valor, the wild folk of the East are still restrained." This is a familiar quote to you if you've been reading The Lord of the Rings lately. "By our valor, the wild folk of the East are still restrained, and the terror of Morgul kept at bay, and thus alone are peace and freedom maintained in the lands behind us, bulwark of the West." So speaks Boromir at the Council of Elrond, and we can see something of that same spirit here, right? "By the swords of the Noldor alone are your sunless woods defended. Your freedom to wander there wild you owe to my kin, and but for them long since you would have labored in thraldom in the pits of Angband." You owe us. How dare you come into my hidden city and challenge me on my right to rule? But for us, you would be imprisoned in Angband, and by extension, so would all of the Sindar, right? So would all of your brethren here in Beleriand. So what do we see by this echo, by this kind of this typological similarity here? Well, we see the seduction of the noble, of the valiant, by their own heroism, right? As someone very wise once put it, right? You'll remember that when Boromir is espousing the strength of Minas Tirith in particular, right? But the strength of Gondor, bulwark of the West, like, without us, you would all be under the heel of the foe already, right? That's very much Boromir's take there. And he's of course, puffing out his chest there in front of elves and a dwarf and a wizard and shirefolk who don't know or care what Gondor is. Oh, and lest we forget, his own king. While he is puffing out his chest there, he's missing the point. It's not about thanks. It's not about an indebtedness by those who are protected. It's back to Faramir, right? What we see here from Turgon, what we see there from Boromir, is exactly what Faramir decries when he's talking to to Frodo. They do love the sharp sword for its brightness and the arrow for its swiftness and the warrior for his glory. They don't love that which it protects. They've put their focus in the wrong place. And that's almost an inescapable part of the tragedy of the Noldor, of the doom of the Noldor, paying attention to the wrong part of their role here in Beleriand, as much as they have like a fixed and focused role in Beleriand. So again, I call this out primarily to note the initial wisdom and courtesy of Turgon. Welcome, kinsman, for so I hold you. Right? This is not like dealing with the sons of Feanor out there in the wilds and the plains of the northeast of Beleriand. No, this is real civility. Welcome, kinsman, for so I hold you. Hey, just so you know, as you enter here into my hidden city, the wedding between you and Arathal, okay, your marriage is a real thing. I take it to be a real thing on her word. And this is extended into a forceful invitation, but an invitation nonetheless. Here you shall dwell at your pleasure, save only that you must here abide and depart not from my kingdom, for it is my law that none who finds the way hither shall depart. Hey, I'm not making a special case for you. This is true of everybody here. Arathal was the only one that I let go, and look at how that turned out. But Eol rejects it. I acknowledge not your law. It's not just that he has a different sort of opinion or that he's refusing this edict, but he does not acknowledge the right of Turgon, the king of Gondolin, right? This is a fundamental breaking point in his comprehension of how the politic of Beleriand is structured. He doesn't acknowledge the coming of the Noldor, the God, I almost wanted to use the word superiority. No, let's be honest here. I do want to use the word superiority because they are, as we are repeatedly told, superior, right? The only people in all of Beleriand who can even touch the Noldor returning from Valinor are those in Doriath who are in close proximity to Melian. That's effectively unambiguous. So here we're seeing a very different... It is, again, pride, right? This is the land of the Teleri to which you bring war and all unquiet dealing ever proudly and unjustly. I would like some citations, please, from Eol about how you have been aggrieved by the Noldor here. Or is this just a discomfort? Is this just a discomfort at the returning Noldor, at this new power in your realm with the threat of more? All of which is to say that what is being presented here by Eol as his rationale is actually a clouding of his real feelings in the situation, a fear, right? I'm resolving to use the word discomfort here, I suppose, rather than any more provocative and emotive language, but that does seem to be what we're getting from Eol here. So he acknowledges that he's not here to spy, but to claim his own, my wife and my son. And he acknowledges here still, in a really gross way, yet if in Arathal your sister you have some claim, then let her remain. Let the bird go back to the cage where soon she will sicken again as she sickened before. You know what? I don't even care. I don't even care about her. He's not really ceding Arathal to Turgon. He doesn't want to acknowledge Turgon's right over Arathal as, brother and king, I suppose, because that's kind of gross anyway. And again, refusing to respect and even acknowledge the right of Turgon to rule demands that he would in fact take Arathal himself. But he will give Arathal up so that she can remain in Gondolin because he knows that she will once again be restless, because he knows that she doesn't want to be here. Not really. But Maeglin is the bigger issue. He issues this command. Come, Maeglin, son of Eol, your father commands you, leave the house of his enemies and the slayers of his kin, or be accursed, to which Turgon replies, hey, it's a simple choice. You get it, and your son gets it too. Do you stay here, or do you die here? And Eol, unfortunately, takes matters into his own hands. Then Eol looked into the eyes of King Turgon, and he was not daunted, but stood long without word or movement, while a stiff silence fell upon the hall. And Arathal was afraid, knowing that he was perilous. Suddenly, swift as serpent, he seized a javelin that he hid beneath his cloak and cast it at Maeglin, crying, the second choice I take, and for my son also, you shall not hold what is mine. But Arathal sprang before the dart, and it smote her in the shoulder, and Eol was overborne by many and set in bonds and led away, while others tended Arathal. But Maeglin, looking upon his father, was silent. It was appointed that Eol should be brought on the next day to the king's judgment, and Arathal and Idril moved Turgon to mercy. But in the evening Arathal sickened, and though the wound had seemed little, and she fell into the darkness, and in the night she died, for the point of the javelin was poisoned, though none knew it until too late. Therefore, when Eol was brought before Turgon, he found no mercy. And they led him forth to the Carrag Dor, a precipice of black rock upon the north side of the hill of Gondolin, there to cast him down from the sheer walls of the city. And Maeglin stood by and said nothing. But at the last Eol cried out, "So you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son." Excuse me. "Here shall you fail of all your hopes, and here may you yet die the same death as I." End quote. And foreshadowing, of course. Carrag Dor, literally dark spike, right? We're familiar with Dor here. This is the same Dor as we find in Barad-dûr in Mordor. There's something very subtly upsetting in this first paragraph. And, we talked a lot last week about the nature of the relationship between Arathal and Eol and how coercive it is and how much consent she is offering and to what degree it is even possible to give full consent under the circumstances of their meeting. We talked about his sorcerous manipulations of the forest to lead her to his home in the first place. And obviously, to offer a little parenthetical there, just in case you didn't hear last week's show, we also talked a little about how we measure her willingness, right? It is not said that she was wholly unwilling, is what the text tells us, which is, the faintest of faint support here for their marriage. Here we see something which is, as I say, unsettling. I find this unsettling. Eol is silent. He's looking into the eyes of King Turgon, right? Which is a direct challenge, right? When you look into the eyes of your liege lord, that is a direct challenge. Stood long without word or movement while a still silence fell upon the hall. And Arathal was afraid, knowing that he was powerless. She knows how quickly he can move to violence. She knows that when he is still, it is not necessarily because he is considering. It is not necessarily because he is at peace. It is something, potentially at least, more ominous. She certainly feels it here. She is afraid, knowing that he was powerless, and she's completely right. He moves immediately to violence, and not a completely sudden, unprompted, wrath of passion kind of violence, but something that is more considered. How do we know it's more considered? Because the javelin is poisoned. It is intended to kill its target no matter what. I find it interesting, too, that we create this space between Arathal's wound and death. And in that space, both Arathal and Idril argue for mercy. This is like the moment after the destruction of the trees, right, in which Feanor is asked to give the Silmarils to Yavanna before anyone knows that they've been taken by Morgoth from Formenos. Before anyone knows that the Silmarils are no longer in the possession of Feanor, he is asked to hand them over, and he says, no, I'm not going to. And we talked, when we discussed that passage, about the importance of giving him that choice, right, of not allowing the plot to compel him or to leave his motivations ambiguous. And here we're kind of doing the same thing, albeit, we're inverting it here. We're not letting, well, I was going to say we're not letting Idril and Arathal off the hook, but of course it's not letting them off the hook. We're giving them the opportunity to demonstrate their character. We're giving them the opportunity to demonstrate great virtue here. Arathal, wounded, still arguing for mercy. It lets us see what is good about Arathal, what is good about Idril, before, ultimately, Arathal's death removes that possibility of mercy from Turgon. We should also note, of course, that in the death of Arathal, we see the death of one of the two granddaughters of Finwë. The only remaining granddaughter of Finwë is Galadriel. And as I say here, explicit foreshadowing here from Eol. So you forsake your father and his kin, ill-gotten son. Here shall you fail of all your hopes, and here you may yet die the same death as I. We'll circle back to what happens to Maeglin in the chapters to come. But first, we're going to establish a new kind of status quo here in Gondolin, including Maeglin and his new role. Then they cast Eol over the Carrag Dor, and so he ended, and to all in Gondolin it seemed just. But Idril was troubled, and from that day she mistrusted her kinsman. But Maeglin prospered and grew great among the Gondolin, praised by all and high in the favor of Turgon. For if he would learn eagerly and swiftly all that he might, he had much also to teach. And he gathered about him all such as had the most bent to smithcraft and mining, and he sought in the Acoriath, which are the encircling mountains, and found rich loads of ore of diverse metals. Most he prized the hard iron of the mine of Angabar in the north of the Acoriath, and thence he got a wealth of forged metal and of steel, so that the arms of the Gondolin were made ever stronger and more keen, and that stood them in good stead in the days to come. Wise in counsel was Maeglin, and wary, and yet hardy and valiant at need. And that was seen in after days. For when in the dread year of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, Turgon opened his leaguer and marched forth with the help of Fingon in the north, Maeglin would not remain in Gondolin as regent of the king, but went to the war and fought beside Turgon, and proved fell and fearless in battle. So, Eol is cast over, and everyone says, good. That was probably the right thing. That was probably the right call. It seemed just, except for Idril. And Idril is troubled because, Idril is troubled because she mistrusts Maeglin. Idril mistrusts Maeglin because she is troubled. Both of those equally true. She mistrusts, I think, the absence of mercy. We've just had this opportunity for Idril to demonstrate her own sense of mercy. And this is important because mercy is a virtue that is more about, it might be argued, the person being merciful, the person arguing for mercy, than it is about the good that is done to the recipient of that mercy, the the mercy, right? The MERCEE, right? the recipient of mercy. Instead, it tells us a lot about Idril. It tells us a lot about Arathel and the absence of mercy, the absence of speech from Maeglin. And Maeglin was silent, and Maeglin said not, right? The absence of speech from Maeglin tells us a lot about his lack of mercy, and Idril correctly discerns that there is something, well, as she says later, right, that there is something crooked within Maeglin at this point. And I think that we can see here too the success of Maeglin in Gondolin as being a kind of proof of that crookedness, of that impurity, of that slightly twisted thing now in the elven character, in particular in the Noldor character, because again, like Turgon, like Boromir, the Gondolin do again love the bright sword for its sharpness, right? They have also fallen under the spell of this almost fey instinct toward battle and violence. They also want to strive against the foe. There is something martial at the heart of Gondolin and the Gondolindrim that exceeds or stands opposed to, stands as frictional with what we might understand to be true elven nature, true elven spirit. And of course, we should remember here that this is the foundation, I suppose, the founding of the greatest smithies of Beleriand at this point, right? The swordcraft of Gondolin is famous. Glamdring and Orcrist, the swords of Gandalf and Thorin Oakenshield himself, are forged in Gondolin. Glamdring, we're told, is the blade of Turgon, and Orcrist is wielded by one of the lords of Gondolin. So we can speculate, maybe even Maeglin himself, maybe Ecthelion, right? These are powerful weapons. And then, of course, we're casting forward here to wise in counsel was Maeglin and wary, and yet hardy and valiant at need. Lest you think that he is just a craftsman, yet lest you think that he spends his days making weapons, that he's wise and that he's sharp, but he's just a counsel to the king. No, he also throws down when it must be thrown down. That was seen in after days, for when in the dread year of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, Turgon opened his leaguer and marched forth to the help of Fingon in the north. Maeglin would not remain in Gondolin as regent of the king, but went to the war and fought beside Turgon and proved fell and fearless in battle. So it's not even that he's brave enough to go. It's not even that he doesn't want to stay behind in Gondolin, safe and secure, when the leaguer of Morgoth is threatened. He rides out with the king and proves himself a formidable warrior. That will occur 72 years after Maeglin first arrives in Gondor. This is the year 400 of the Year of the Sun. And as I said before, we're about to rewind when we start the next chapter, which we will do after our little ominous epilogue to this chapter of Maeglin. Thus all seemed well with the fortunes of Maeglin, who had risen to be mighty among the princes of the Noldor, and greatest save one and the most renowned of their realms. Yet he did not reveal his heart. And though not all things went as he would, he endured it in silence, hiding his mind so that few could read it, unless it were Idril Celebrimbor. For from his first days in Gondolin he had borne a grief ever worsening that robbed him of all joy. He loved the beauty of Idril and desired her without hope. The Eldar wedded not with kin so near, nor ever before had any desired to do so. And however that might be, Idril loved Maeglin not at all. And knowing his thought of her, she loved him the less, for it seemed to her a thing strange and crooked in him, as indeed the Eldar ever since have deemed it, an evil fruit of the kinslaying, whereby the shadow of the curse of Mandos fell upon the last hope of the Noldor. But as the years passed, still Maeglin watched Idril and waited, and his love turned to darkness in his heart. And he sought the more to have his will in other matters, shirking no toil or burden if he might thereby have power. Thus it was in Gondolin. And amid all the bliss of that realm, while its glory lasted, a dark seed of evil was sown. When I was foreshadowing this chapter in previous weeks here on Stars and Swords, I was referring to Maeglin as just the worst. And Maeglin is, God, he's a competitor. He's up there. He is going to make, top 5 worst characters in the Legendarium by basically any metric. And yeah. Maybe not worst in terms of how they are written or how they are presented on the page. I suppose I should clarify that. But yeah, most evil characters, he will be engaged in probably the greatest act of treachery that we see in the pages of the Silmarillion. Even that is a tough ranking to put together here on the fly. So everything seems to be going well. Maeglin's getting both what he explicitly wanted and what he implicitly wanted, right? Now he's living in Gondor, where everything is sunlight and brightness and wonder and beauty. The city's amazing. The people are amazing. He's crafting these swords that he loves so well, using all the skills taught to him by the Naugrim, right? Not only is he learning quickly of the smiths of Gondolin, but he is also teaching them a great deal because he has knowledge that they don't. So he's very successful professionally. He's fitting into the power structures of Gondolin, and everything seems to be going great, except that he's in love with his cousin. Well, that's actually not true, is it? He's not in love with his cousin. I think that the precision of the language here is extremely important. For from his first days in Gondolin, he had borne a grief ever worsening that robbed him of all joy. He loved the beauty of Idril and desired her without hope. So it's not exactly, right? Loving the beauty of Idril and desiring her is not quite the same thing as loving Idril. There is something incomplete there, and something jealous, right? He wants the beauty of Idril. He wants to possess her. He desires her. It's something that is about domination rather than supplication, right? This is not the relationship that we see between Thingol and Melian, for example, or really the relationship that we see between any two good and compatible romantic partners in the Legendarium. This is something dark, and it's a fuller manifestation of that kind of darkness because they are first cousins. The Eldar wedded not with kin so near, nor ever before had any desire to do so. So there's not a functional incest taboo in elven society because no one has ever wanted to do it, right? The reason that we have an incest taboo is that at some point in history it was decided that it was rational, that it was wise, it was prudent to have exactly that kind of taboo. But the elves don't need it because no one's ever wanted to. Why would we make a rule that you can't do this thing if no one ever wants to do this thing? And however that might be, right? Regardless. Okay, societal convention aside, regardless of that, Idril loved Maeglin not at all, and knowing his thought of her, she loved him the less, for it seemed to her a thing strange and crooked in him, as indeed the Eldar ever since have deemed it. An evil fruit of the kinslaying is so interesting, right? How does the doom of Mandos, right? The doom of the Noldor, the curse of Mandos, as it's referred to here, how does that manifest here as this twisted desire, as this strange, unlovely thing, this crooked thing within the heart of Maeglin? Except that all desire within the heart of the Noldor, right? All desire within this corrupt branch of the elven family tree turns to darkness. It always turns to the obsessive. I think that you can see Maeglin's desire for Idril as sitting companionably alongside Turgon's desire for glory, right? The martial conditioning of Gondolin. And of course, it's easy to look at this and say, well, of course Gondolin is martially inclined because They are the great hidden city. They are the last bastion of the elves, should Morgoth rise once again. And they live in a condition of ongoing war, the ongoing siege of Angband, the leaguer of Morgoth, right? They are in a state of basically Cold War all the time. But not everyone lives like this. Not everyone takes it to this extent, to this extremity. This is not how things are in Doriath. This is not how things are in Nargothrond, right? Which is the direct one-to-one comparison with Gondolin. Nargothrond is constructed at the same time, at the same instruction of Ulmo, and it's different. We're going to see how Finrod Felagund is conducting himself as we move into the next chapter here, and we're going to find something very different, I think, from Turgon. So Turgon is great and wise and kingly and rules with a righteous authority, but it is something that is stained. Like all the deeds of the Noldor, it is corrupted by the doom of Mandos. It is corrupted by this judgment levied upon them following the kinslaying at Alqualondë. There's a stain that cannot be removed. We're getting a damn spot here that is going to continue to taint the Noldor going forward. Thus it was in Gondolin, and amid the bliss of that realm, while its glory lasted, a dark seed of evil was sown. Oh, I should note again, just because I really do delight in how astutely Tolkien depicts this throughout his work. You know, we talked so recently about this, extending all the way back to the Ainulindale and Melkor and Varda, right? Melkor wanting Varda and her rejection of him being this thing that kind of sours within him. Again, we're seeing it so clearly here. Maeglin watched Idril and waited, and his love turned to darkness in his heart, and he sought the more to have his will in other matters, shirking no toil or burden, if he might thereby have power. He is being denied the thing that he wants. So instead of finding a peace or a wisdom or a place of settlement with regard to that, he instead continues to amass power. He will work hard so that he can be more powerful and he can enact his will, the more to have his will in other matters. Bad things are coming. This also, I should mention, we're going to get explicit reference to surprising. I had completely forgotten that we get surprising and explicit reference to Turin Turambar in the next chapter. But this also works as a kind of functional foreshadowing of Turin, who we'll get to in just a few, 4 weeks. We're going to be spending some time looking at some long chapters in the next few weeks here. So I think the next 4, we cover 1 chapter a week just so we can get through it all. And with that said then, and probably halfway into this week's session, let's move on to Chapter 17, The Coming of Man into the West. When 300 years and more were gone since the Noldor came to Beleriand, in the days of the long peace, Finrod Felagund, lord of Nargothrond, journeyed east of Sirion and went hunting with Maglor and Maithros, sons of Feanor. But he wearied of the chase, and passed on alone toward the mountains of arid Linden that he saw shining afar. And taking the dwarf road, he crossed Gallion at the ford of Sarnathrad, and turning south over the upper streams of Asgar, he came into the north of Assyriand. In a valley among the foothills of the mountains, below the springs of Thalos, he saw lights in the evening, and far off he heard the sound of song. At this he wondered much, for the green elves of that land lit no fires, nor did they sing by night. At first he feared that a raid of orcs had passed the leaguer of the north, but as he drew near, he perceived that it was not so, for the singers used a tongue that he had not heard before, neither that of dwarves nor of orcs. Then Felagund, standing silent in the night shadow of the trees, looked down into the camp, and there he beheld a strange people. Now these were a part of the kindred and the following of Beor the Old, as he was afterwards called, a chieftain among men. After many lives of wandering out of the east, he had led them at last over the Blue Mountains, the first of the race of men to enter Beleriand, and they sang because they were glad, and believed that they had escaped from all perils, and had come at last to a land without fear. So, as promised in the title of the chapter, men have come into the west. The arid Linden, as we get here, as you probably guessed, are the arid Luin, the Blue Mountains in the east of Beleriand on the west of the Middle-earth map of the Third Age. They're called the arid Linden, that is the mountains of Linden, because Linden is another name for Assyriand, the realm of 7 rivers here in eastern Beleriand. Linden, interestingly, will be the only part of Beleriand which survives the First Age. So the use of that name here, alongside the introduction of men, I think isn't casual. I think that this is Tolkien kind of reorienting a part of his narrative voice to look forward to the age of men. Men have now shown up, and hey, they're going to be pretty important, particularly as we move out of the First Age. We should note, again, as I've said, that we're jumping around here in the timeline. This is the year 310. This is 200 years or so after the founding of Nargothrond and Gondolin. So we're now deep into the long peace, but we're 6 years at this point before Arathal leaves Gondolin in the first place. We're 10 years before the birth of Maeglin, and basically, 100 years before what we just saw at the end of the preceding chapter. Yeah, good. We should say, this is also 300 years or so, more or less, after men awake in Hildorian, as we learned back in Chapter 12. Back in Chapter 12, we saw, or had an accounting at least, of men awaking in Hildorian at the rising of the sun. That was the event that sparked everything off. So here, in the year 310 of the sun, men have been around for about 300 years. There's something really cute here with Beor the Old, the name Beor the Old, as he was afterwards called, right? Because at this point, neither part of this is true. His name is not yet Beor, and he is not yet old. Well, he's 58, so he's a respectable age, to be sure, but not really. 58 would not be considered the old. That doesn't earn you that title in your name, I think. But yeah, he's called Balan right now, Balan. And as I say, he's 58 when Finrod Felagund first espies their encampment. I want to briefly pause before we continue into this chapter because of Chapter 12, right, that I've referenced a couple of times already in this week's session, because I want to call out how men were introduced then and how men are being introduced now, because we're getting another sense of intertextuality, of a kind of limited paratextuality within this bound volume of the Silmarillion, because our focus is changing, our tone is certainly changing. Let's go back. I just want to read this short excerpt looking at how men are introduced back in Chapter 12. Quote, "At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Iluvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. But the first sun arose in the west, and the opening eyes of men were turned towards it, and their feet as they wandered over the earth for the most part strayed that way. The Atani they were named by the Eldar, the second people. But they called them also Hildor, the followers, and many other names. Apananar, the afterborn, Engwar, the sickly, Firimar, the mortals, and they named them the usurpers, the strangers, and the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, the children of the sun." So we're seeing here already, I think, as Finrod in his wisdom and generosity and yes, a kind of mercy being practiced here already. As Finrod looks down upon this encampment, we feel, I think, very differently than we did back there in Chapter 12. I called this out at the time, right? These names, the names that the elves use for the humans, the Atani, right? The second people, completely objective, completely fine. The followers, fine. The afterborn, okay. The sickly, the mortals, all right, maybe a little judgmental, but still objectively true. But then we get into the real kind of pro-Feanorian kind of propaganda that we get, right? This kind of pro-Elven propaganda, part of, we might assume at that time in particular, this web of lies created by Morgoth, a theme to which we will return in this week's reading, right? They are the usurpers, the strangers, the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, the children of the sun. And we've just spent an entire chapter looking at light and dark in this new elven culture in Beleriand, right? That the night is no longer this safe, comforting, lovely, virtuous thing as it was for elves through untold thousands of years, right before the rising of the sun. There's no sense that the elves in Beleriand were, I was casually going to use the word benighted, which is, of course, the worst possible word to use in this circumstance. But there's no sense in which they were struggling or laboring under the starlit skies of Beleriand prior to the coming of the sun. That was just the world, and they loved it, right? How often do we refer back to the starlit skies of Cuivanen? This is part of what it is to be an elf. But now, since the sun has come to Middle-earth, we've kind of transitioned into this pro-light, kind of not completely anti-dark, but skeptical of the dark, right? As we keep referring to Eol as the dark elf, we're doing so with kind of a heavy hand in terms of distinguishing between the elves of the darkness and the elves of the new and improved sun. Hey, the sun is great. But here, again, we're taking this kind of Noldor propagandistic perspective, right? The night fearers, the children of the sun, said so dismissively. But that is not what we are going to get here as we actually move to meet the elves, to meet the man. I should call out, too, a really interesting aspect here, that when Finrod is approaching the camp, he hears the music, right? He sees the sparks of the fires and he hears the music. And he knows that this is not the Lyquendi. He knows that these are not the green elves of Asuryan because they don't light fires and they don't sing songs by night. Why don't they light fires or sing songs by night? Because they are the hidden people. They are the ones who retreated following the death of their king during the first battle of Beleriand. They're they are the ones who have taken to the deep forests of Asuryan and take no further part, really, in these proceedings. They're going to show up again in just a couple pages. We'll get the opportunity to talk a little more about them. But he knows that it's not them because they do not make themselves visible or audible at night. So what does he think? Of course, he leaps to the obvious conclusion. Oh, there's a campfire and I can hear singing. It must be a band of orcs. Which tells us that the orcs sing? The orcs sing around a campfire? I mean, it's kind of incontrovertible, right? But doesn't fit, I think, very comfortably with our understanding of who the orcs are. The fact that it takes Finrod, he has to be close enough that he can make out the language and understand that it is neither dwarven nor orcish. That, I think, is really telling and might make us reconsider a little bit about how we approach the question of the orcs as we move into a new era of war here in Beleriand, which is really going to be next week's reading. But we're still setting the stage. And I'll apologize too in advance because this really is the begetting chapter. This really is, for all that we talked about that back when we were discussing of Beleriand and its realms, and this has the benefit of being much shorter than that chapter. There are just a lot of names. We're going to get 3 whole new houses, 3 whole new tribes, in effect, of man coming into Beleriand, and they are going to splinter and fracture. It's not going to be as bad as some versions of this that we've seen before. Like, typologically, we are now in a different octave of the story, right? This is a repetition that we've seen, a repetition of events that we have effectively seen before, but it's going to be in a lower key. Everything's just a little more close to the ground. Let's, in fact, get into that because we're going to specifically call that out as we move in here, as Finrod decides to recapitulate the entire history of Arda for the benefit of these strange men. Long Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart, but he remained hidden in the trees until they had all fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people and sat beside their dying fire where none kept watch, and he took up a rude harp which Bear had laid aside, and he played music upon it, such as the ears of man had not heard, for they had as yet no teachers in the art save only the dark elves in the wildlands. Now men awoke and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him, but they did not speak or stir while Felagund still played, because of the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the Elven king, and the hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him, for the things of which he sang of the making of Arda and the bliss of a man beyond the shadows of the sea came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Thus it was that men called King Felagund, who they first met of all the Eldar, Gnome, that is, wisdom. And in the language of that is wisdom in the language of that people, and after him they named his folk Nomen, the wise. Indeed, they believed at first that Felagund was one of the Valar, of whom they had heard rumour that they dwelt far in the west, and this was, some say, the cause of their journeying. But Felagund dwelt among them and taught them true knowledge, and they loved him, and took him for their lord, and were afterwards loyal to the house of Finarfin. So, typologically, we're seeing this recapitulation of the history of Arda. Finrod singing of the Ainulindalë, right? Singing of the creation of the world, of the song of the creation of the world, of the lore taught to the elves by the Valar and the history of the elves. So we're seeing a version of all that has gone before now reoccurring. What's most interesting here, I think, there's a couple. There are a handful of things that are most interesting. I like very much the idea that the men have made it over the mountains, are now singing, right? The songs of this peaceful realm in which they have found themselves, songs that their woes and that the darkness has been left behind them, and they haven't even set a watch. They haven't set a watch because they believe themselves to be safe. They believe themselves to have overcome all difficulties around them. And that allows Felagund to enter into their camp, though I doubt that a watch of these men could have prevented Finrod Felagund from entering into their camp in the first place. So he takes up this rude harp, right? The men of Middle-earth, they have music, they have instruments. Not only do they have music and they have instruments, but they brought a little harp with them over the mountains, over the Ered Luin into Beleriand in the first place. So music is clearly something that is of value to them. They understand its worth. And though it is a rude little instrument, though it is like, not rude in the sense that it is, profane in any way, but rather that it is clumsily made, it doesn't matter because Felagund can take it up and play music that they've never heard before. Music that awakes them, right? They awaken, they listen to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him, but they did not speak or stir while Felagund was still playing, because this music is a kind of magic. It is a kind of wisdom. It's a reflection. Those who look upon the trees of Valinor, you can tell afterwards that the light is still in their faces, that the light is in their eyes, and we have a version of that here. Their hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him, for the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda, the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes, and his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. He's communicating them not through direct language, right? They can't speak Sindarin. They can't speak the language of the elves. They just receive, they kind of can, as we'll see in the following slides here, but they're receiving these impressions directly through the art. And this is a perfect example, and a relatively rare example, honestly. It's not rare that people make art in the pages of Professor Tolkien's work, but it is rare that we see the consequence of art this directly. This is secondary creation. This is literally the refraction of the light of God through a creative act. And in that creation, we gain, the audience gains some measure of wisdom, of knowledge, of sight, of sense, of light. They can touch God through the secondary creation. That is what Tolkien believes all art does. That is the creative purpose. That is why we feel compelled to create. And here we're seeing that mimicked very directly, I think, by Finrod Felagund. And it's so effective that the men immediately bend the knee, right? Thus it was that men called King Felagund, whom they first met of all the Eldar, Gnome, that is wisdom in the language of that people, and after him they named his folk Nomen the Wise. In fact, they think he's one of the Valar. They've heard of the Valar. How have they heard of the Valar? Well, they heard of the Valar from Avari, right? The elves the dark elves here, as they're referred to, who do not take up the invitation to come to Valinor and just stay in the east. They have met the men already and told them tales of the Valar, though clearly, we might expect, I suppose, kind of, casually and colloquially, we might expect that the Avari have a kind of dim view of the Valar. After all, they choose not to accept the invitation and go to Aman in the first place. So maybe we would think they're a little skeptical. They don't really know what to make of the Valar, but it turns out, no, they still speak very warmly of the Valar. They still speak incompletely, obviously, because they don't have direct knowledge. The three ambassadors who go to Valinor in the first place and then return to the elves all go. That's Ingwe and Olwe and Elwë, of course. The leaders of the three tribes of the elves that depart into the west. But the Avari still have some knowledge of the Valar and share that knowledge with the men that they meet. So much so that the men believe that Finrod Felagund, as he shows up here, is one of the Valar. We should note the pun here. I mentioned this a long time ago, back when we were talking about Professor Tolkien's original conception of the different kinds of elves, right? One of the reasons that we have this elven diaspora into Beleriand first and then into Valinor and then back from Valinor, and we kind of just keep moving these various populations of elves around and splintering their language and reforming their cultures, their societies, their communities. One of the reasons that we do that is so that Professor Tolkien has access to this kind of taxonomic diversity of elven kind, right? He can account for all the various kinds of elves that we find in fairy stories by creating different communities of elves. They're all related. They're all unified. They are all Eldar. They are all kind of sprung forth from this singular origin point. They are all the elder children of Iluvatar, but they are subtly different. And this, I take this to be a joke. I really do take this to be a joke. It's a lovely joke, if it is indeed a joke, because the Noldor were originally gnomes. That was going to be right. They are the wisest, the craftiest, the most skilled in the use of their hands, the use of their tools. They were going to. They are literally in the first drafts of chunks of the material that becomes the Silmarillion, described as gnomes. And then he recants on that, and because that word has been taken over and does not quite have the same mythopoetic weight as the constructed languages that he includes here in the text. So this use of the word gnome, that is wisdom in the language of his people, and after them they called the folk gnomen, the wise, right? Like not distinct from gnome, Gnome. It's just a nice play on words there. I enjoy that very much. So let's move on here. We're going to talk a little more about this ability to Finrod's ability to make himself understood. Let's switch back to the slides here and we can continue on. Now the Eldar were beyond all other people skilled in tongues, and Felagund discovered that also that he could read in the minds of men such thoughts as they wished to reveal in speech, so that their words were easily interpreted. It is said also that these men had long had dealings with the Dark Elves east of the mountains, and from them had learned much of their speech, and since all the languages of the Quendi were of one origin, the language of Beor and his folk resembled the Elven tongue in many words and devices. It was not long, therefore, before Felagund could hold converse with Beor, and while he dwelt with him they spoke much together. But when he questioned him concerning the arising of man and their journeys, Beor would say little, and indeed he knew little, for the fathers of his people had told few tales of their past, and a silence had fallen upon their memory. A darkness lies behind us, Beor said, and we have turned our backs upon it. We do not desire to return thither, even in thought. Westwards our hearts have been turned, and we believe there we shall find light. But it was said afterwards among the Eldar that when men awoke in Hildorian at the rising of the sun, the spies of Morgoth were watchful, and tidings were soon brought to him, and this seemed to him so great a matter that secretly under shadow he himself departed from Angband, and went forth into Middle-earth, leaving to Sauron the command of the war. Of his dealings with men the Eldar indeed know nothing at that time, and learnt but little afterwards, and what a darkness lay on the hearts of men as the shadow of the kinslaying and the doom of Mandos lay upon the Noldor, they perceived clearly even in the people of the elf friends whom they first knew. To corrupt or destroy whatsoever arose new and fair was ever the chief desire of Morgoth, and doubtless he had this purpose also in this errand, by fear and lies to make men the foes of the Eldar, and bring them up out of the east against Beleriand. But this design was slow to ripen and was never wholly achieved, for men, it is said, were at first very few in number, whereas Morgoth grew afraid of the growing power and union of the Eldar and came back to Angband, leaving behind at that time but few servants, and those of less might and cunning. So Morgoth's schemes here. We are told that Morgoth leaves Angband. We're told this back in Chapter 9, right? Following the confrontation with Ungoliant, Morgoth flees back to Angband. He delves new caverns. He makes the iron crown to mount to the Silmarils. And we are told, quote, "Never but once only did he depart for a while secretly from his domain in the north. Seldom indeed did he leave the deep places of his fortress, but governed his armies from his northern throne. And once only did he himself wield weapon while his realm lasted." This is the secret departure that is referenced there. And we'll see that last wielding of the weapon in next week's reading, which is to pull upon my many years of literary study and analysis, to pull upon the full breadth and limit of my education. Super cool. It is awesome. So we're going to get a chance to discuss that next week. If you've been wondering where the prophesied and foreshadowed moment that is the most metal in all of the Silmarillion that I talked about a few weeks ago, it's coming in next week's reading, you guys. I hope that you'll be able to join me for that discussion. So I mentioned this before. The shadowed parts of the history of men in Middle-earth is a conscious means on Professor Tolkien's part to reconcile his secondary creation and his real-world theological beliefs. He preserves compatibility between the two. He does so in part because of what is still, I think at this point, a kind of effective conceptual framework for the Silmarillion, for the deep history of the Legendarium, that it is mythologically speaking, a history of our real world, less and less specifically so, less and less accurately so, as he continues to revise it. But he does want to maintain a compatibility there between the thing that he is making, right? The schematic that's being presented to us and his real Catholic values and beliefs. So this is where he leaves the gap, because he has to leave a gap. There has to be some measure of original sin here present in the hearts of man, even in Middle-earth, that can ultimately be redeemed long outside the constraints, the frame of Middle-earth by the death of Christ on the cross, right? He still wants that redemption, that paying of sin to be real, to be compatible with his mythological foundation here, with his created story of creation, as it were. So he leaves the space and preserves a kind of silence about it. And nobody knows. We don't talk about it. A darkness lies behind us, Beor said, and we have turned our backs upon it, and we do not desire to return thither even in thought. Westwards our hearts have been turned, and we believe that it is there we shall find light. The capital L, light there. Why do they believe that they will find light in the west? Well, the Avari have been telling them about the Valar. The Avari have been telling them about the offer that was made to them, the offer that it turns out that they could refuse. But also, we learned a little about this back in Chapter 12. We were told that Ulmo comes to men, that he sends messages in streams and floods, but they are not as sensitive to the workings of the world as the elves are, and because they're not as sensitive, they don't get the messages exactly. The quote that we get in Chapter 12 is, "Therefore they loved the waters, and their hearts were stirred, but they understood not the messages." But they get the sense nonetheless that there's something in the west. Westward, our hearts have been turned, right? They have been forcibly kind of oriented here, and that's by the Avari and presumably by the intercession of Ulmo too, even though the men themselves don't completely understand it. And we should acknowledge to Professor Tolkien's secret passion, secret vice, right? As he himself had it here for linguistics. The Eldar were beyond all other peoples skilled in tongues, and Felgen discovered also that he could read in the minds of men such thoughts as they wished to reveal in speech. Wow, I mean, that's a hell of a skill, right? He can, if you want to express something such that you are composing it in speech, Finrod Felgen can just read it right out of your head. He doesn't have to speak your language. He can just kind of read the intent to speak and understand what it is that you want to say. And we're distinguishing very carefully there between those words which are consciously held, those words which the bearer of that thought is seeking to express, right? It's not just even that they're superficially within the mind. The speaker is trying to express them, and thus Finrod can read them, and we can oppose that with perhaps Maeglin's ability to delve into the unguarded thoughts within one's mind. So Finrod can read them immediately and kind of get like a working discourse, but also he's familiar with their language because much of the language of men has come from the language of the Avari and all the languages of the Quendi, right? The Quendi, the original name for all of the elves who awoke at Cuivanen, those who speak with language, that was how they named themselves. That is the most important definitive thing about elves in terms of distinguishing themselves from everything else in the world, is that they can speak with language. Well, sure. The languages of men, particularly the languages of Beor here, have been informed by the languages of the Avari, and thus there's commonality. There's enough similarity with this new and evolved form of elven tongue that Finrod speaks. There's enough commonality that he can begin to piece together a working language, right? He can piece together a working syntax. He can piece together a working grammar. He can piece together a working lexicon, and then begin to speak directly with Beor. Though, not so much about the arising of men and their journeys, because Beor would say little and indeed knew little. So we see a real compatibility here and a real it's so easy to pass over the tiny little things here in the previous slide as we're looking at Finrod looking down upon the encampment, and he feels love stir in his heart. This is one of the ways that we know that Finrod is, a good dude, capital G, capital D, is because he loves those things that are not himself. He loves those things which are different from him. That is part of the passion that leads those Ainur who descend into Arda to descend into Arda. That is one of the reasons that the world such as it is created, is this love of things which is different from ourselves. That's why Aule creates the dwarves. He wants to love and to teach those things which are different from himself. And now we're seeing all of this again, as I say, in a lower key. We're seeing it closer to the ground. Yes, as Aule is to the dwarves, as Orome is to the elves at Cuivanen, so Finrod Felagund is to the men of Beor the Old here in the shadow of the Ered Luin. Let's progress, though, because not everyone is going to be happy about the coming of elves. Not everyone is going to be happy about the coming of men into Beleriand, including the aforementioned Lyquendi. Now Felagund learned from Beor that there were many other men of like mind who were also journeying westward. Others of my own kin have crossed the mountains, he said, and they are wandering not far away, and the Haladin, a people from whom we are sundered in speech, are still in the valleys on the eastern slopes, awaiting tidings before they venture further. There are yet other men whose tongue is more like to ours, with whom they have had dealings at times. They were before us on the westward march, but we passed them, for they are a numerous people, and yet keep together and move slowly, being all ruled by one chieftain whom they call Marach. Now the green elves of Assyrian were troubled by the coming of men, and when they heard that a lord of the Eldar from over the sea was among them, they sent messages to Felagund. Lord, they said, if you have power over these newcomers, bid them return by the ways they came, or else to go forward, for we desire no strangers in this land to break the peace in which we live. And these folk are hewers of trees and hunters of beasts, therefore we are their unfriends, and if they will not depart, we shall afflict them in all ways that we can. Then, by the advice of Felagund, Beor gathered all the wandering families and kindreds of his people, and they removed over Gallion, and took up their abode in the lands of Amrod and Amras, upon the east banks of the Kellon, south of Nan Almoth, near to the borders of Doriath, and the name of that land thereafter was Estelad, the encampment. And when, after a year had passed, Felagund wished to return to his own country, Beor begged leave to come with him, and he remained in the service of the king of Nargothrond while his life lasted. In this way he got his name, Beor, whereas his name before had been Balan, for Beor signified vassal in the tongue of his people. The rule of his folk he committed to Baran, his elder son, and he did not return again to Estelad. So, three things. We're seeing here, as we're discussing all of these echoes of the past, right? It might not surprise us to learn that the men have splintered into different tribes and groups, just as the elves did during their journey west. Some have moved quickly, some have moved slowly. One of them is ruled by one chieftain. One of them has a kind of king, some guy called Marach, who we'll get to meet in the pages to come. And the Lyquendi are unhappy, right? This is not so fantastic. I mentioned before that Lyquendi are the branch of the Teleri who hung out in the Vale of Anduin, right? Speaking of the diaspora of the elves coming west, they are the ones who, under the rulership of Lenwë, they hesitated at the Misty Mountains, and then they passed south down the Anduin into the Vale of Anduin and stayed there for a while, and then came into Beleriand much later. Then, during that first battle, the nameless battle of Beleriand, their king Denethor died on Amon Ereb, and that was what triggered this branch of the Teleri to retreat into the forest and become the Green Elves themselves. And now they're here. They are sending forth message, right? A lord of the Eldar from over the sea was among these newcomers. So they go straight to Felagund, who they recognize as an authority, presumably because he comes from Valinor. If you have no power over, if you have power over these newcomers, bid them return by the ways that they came, or else to go forward, for we desire no strangers in this land to break the peace in which we live. They have retreated. They do not want war. They want to live their peaceful lives. These folks are hewers of trees and hunters of beasts, therefore we are their unfriends. Just a fantastic, archaic, weird, wild formulation from Professor Tolkien there. Therefore we are their unfriends, and if they will not depart, we shall afflict them in all ways that we can. So Finrod does the right thing, right? He leads the men of Beor west. They remove over Gallion and take up their abode in the lands of Amrod and Amras. We'll take a look at the map of Beleriand a little at the beginning of next week's session, just to kind of gloss a little bit where these different tribes of men live. But, we're going to spend a lot of time moving these populations around within the span of this chapter, so I don't want to spend too much time establishing now where anyone is, because they're not going to be there for long. So ultimately we get this friendship here between Beor and Finrod Felagund. A friendship, right? But also a kind of service. There is here an implicit understanding from the men, from the men of good heart, right? The elf friends, as we'll describe them imminently, that the elves are, again, right? I want to hold off on language like superior, but they are closer to the Valar, closer to Iluvatar than the men themselves are. That there is a kind of a hierarchy here, that they are powerful in ways that the men are not. It's no coincidence that Balan, going into the kingdom of Nargothrond, going with Finrod to serve him, takes the name vassal in his own tongue, right? He is recognizing this semi-quasi-feudal relationship between himself as a man and Finrod as a king of elves, yes, but also just an elf. There is a hierarchical relationship at play here. And we see here, too, the seed that will grow into a full page of begatting in just a few slides' time, because Balin commits the leadership of his folk here to Baran, his elder son. There's a lot of changing a single letter in a name to indicate this passage of generations, and it can be tough to keep everyone straight. When we do get to the page of begatting, it will give you the name of basically every human being that you have to pay attention to as we move forward through the rest of the Silmarillion. So it is effective as far as that goes, but yeah, it can be a lot to process. So let's get back to this idea of Marach and the coming of other types of human beings into Beleriand. Soon after the departure of Felagund, the other men of whom Beor had spoken came also into Beleriand. First came the Haladin, but meeting the unfriendship of the Green Elves, they turned north and dwelt in Thargelion, in the country of Caranthir, son of Feanor. There for a time they had peace, and the people of Caranthir paid little heed to them. In the next year, Marach led his people over the mountains. They were a tall and warlike folk, marching in ordered companies, and the elves of Assyriand hid themselves and did not waylay them. But Marach, hearing that the people of Beor were dwelling in a green and fertile land, came down the dwarf road and settled in the country south and east of the dwellings of Baran, son of Beor, and there was great friendship between those peoples. Felagund himself often returned to visit men, and many other elves came out of the Westlands. Both Noldor and Sindar journeyed to Estelad, being eager to see the Edain, whose coming had long been foretold. Now Atani, the second people, was the name given to men in Valinor in the lore that told of their coming, but in the speech of Beleriand the name became Edain, and it was there used only of the three kindreds of the elf friends. Fingolfin, as king of all the Noldor, sent messages of welcome to them. And then many young and eager men of the Edain went away and took service with the kings and lords of the Eldar. Among them was Malach, son of Marach, and he dwelt in Hithlum for 14 years, and he learned the elven tongue and was given the name of Aradan. So, three houses, three kindreds, three tribes here of men coming into Beleriand, and we'll track their movement a little bit here, but we're also going to circle back around at the end of the chapter to really define them purposefully and intentionally as we go forward. We have them here, the people of Beor, the people of Malach, and between the two, crucially, the Haladrim, the house of Haleth, who go to live with not to live with Caranthir and the House of Feanor in the northeast, but to live alongside Caranthir and the House of Feanor in the northeast. Caranthir, another one of the sons of Feanor, of whom we should be a little bit skeptical. A helpful rule, if you're trying to remember the sons of Feanor, is that sons whose name begins with M are pretty cool, and sons whose names begin with C are generally not so much. Curufin and Caranthir, the worst of the sons of Feanor by some distance. And then we get the name here, right? Atani, the second people, was the name given to men in Valinor in the lore that told of their coming, right? When the Valar finally reveal to the elves who live in Aman that, there are other kids coming. Because remember that it is part of Melkor's propaganda campaign, his twisting of the Noldori heart in Aman, that he is the first to tell them of the coming of the second children of Iluvatar. The other Valar haven't mentioned it, presumably because they just haven't thought to, but when they do, they name them the Atani. That becomes here in Beleriand the Edain. That is the name used by the elves to describe men, though technically only the three kindreds of the elf friends, these three houses, these three families, right? The people of Beor, the people of Malach, and the Haladrim, the people of Haleth, who, as I say, go to live alongside Caranthir in the northeast. But not everyone is happy about the coming of these new folks all the way into Beleriand, including Thingol. The Edain did not long dwell content in Estelad, for many still desired to go westward, but they did not know the way. Before them lay the fences of Doriath, and southward lay Sirion and its impassable fens. Therefore the kings of the three houses of the Noldor, seeing hope of strength in the sons of men, sent word that any of the Edain that wished might remove and come to dwell among their people. In this way the migration of the Edain began, at first little by little, but later in families and kindreds they arose and left Estelad, until after some 50 years many thousands had entered the lands of the kings. Most of these took the long road northwards, until the ways became well known to them. The people of Beor came to Dorthonion and dwelt in lands ruled by the house of Finarfin. The people of Aradan, for Marach his father remained in Estelad until his death, for the most part went on westward, and some came to Hithlum, But Magor, son of Adadan, and many of the people passed down Sirion into Beleriand and dwelt a while in the vales of the southern slopes of Eredwethrin. It is said that in all these matters none save Finrod Felagund took counsel with King Thingol, and he was ill-pleased, both for that reason and because he was troubled by dreams concerning the coming of man, ere ever the first tidings of them were heard. Therefore he commanded that men should take no lands to dwell in, save in the north, and that the princes whom they served should be answerable for all that they did. And he said, into Doriath shall no man come while my realm lasts, not even those of the house of Beor who serve Finrod the beloved. Melian said nothing to him at that time, but afterwards she said to Galadriel, now the world runs on swiftly to great tidings. And one of man, even of Beor's house, shall indeed come, and the guerdon of Melian shall not restrain him, for doom greater than my power shall send him, and the songs that shall spring from that coming shall endure when all Middle-earth is changed. So, kind of wishing that Thingol would take more counsel from Melian, but he does get a little counsel from Finrod, and he's upset at that, partly because Finrod is the only one who is talking to him about the coming of man into Beleriand, and partly because, we are told here, for the first time, he has been troubled by dreams concerning the coming of man for a long time, ere ever the first tidings of them were heard. Long before anyone else had thought of the coming of man into Beleriand, Thingol has been dreaming of them, and he is troubled. So he says, no, you don't get to spread all the way through Beleriand. You have to go and live in the north. And if you are going to take service with one of the princes of the Noldor, if you're going to, join in and be counted among the retinue of these princes of the Noldor, then they will be responsible for the actions of the man under their command. And furthermore, into Doriath shall no man come while my realm lasts, not even those of the house of Beor who serve Finrod the beloved. And Melian says, okay, darling. But later she talks to Galadriel. Now the world runs on swiftly to great tidings, and one of man, even of Beor's house, shall indeed come, right? Specifically, the house that has just been excluded by Thingol, right? No man shall come while my realm lasts, not even those of the house of Beor. He is specifically excluding the house of Beor. And Melian says, nope, actually someone will come, and it will be of the house of Beor. One man shall come, and the girdle of Melian shall not restrain him, for doom greater than my power shall send him. And the songs that shall spring from that coming shall endure when all Middle-earth is changed. Spoilers, you guys were talking about Beren, right? Beren is going to show up in the reading the week after next. In fact, we're 2 weeks out from of Beren and Luthien, one of the greatest of Professor Tolkien stories. In fact, I will say the next few weeks. This is kind of a setup week, right? Because we wound up finishing up the story of Maeglin, or at least beginning the story of Maeglin. We didn't even really get to like a crisis point with Maeglin proper in this week's reading, and now we're getting the coming of men to Beleriand, but we're setting the stage for what comes next. Next week's reading is a banger. The following week's reading is a banger. The 2 weeks after that, banger after banger. We're really on an upward swing here in terms of just excitement, right? In terms of cool things happening, we are really about to set the ball rolling, to set things in motion very powerfully here. So we have, over the course of 50 years, thousands of men distributing themselves all across Beleriand and taking this kind of active service with the princes of the Noldor, with the various rulers of Beleriand. I don't think there's anything there in particular that I want to call out. No, I think we're good. We can move on now. With all of this foreshadowing about Beren of the House of Beor, we can get to some active discord. But many men remained in Estelad, and there was still a mingled people living there long years after, until in the ruin of Beleriand they were overwhelmed or fled back into the east. For beside the old, who deemed that their wandering days were over, there were not a few who desired to go their own ways, and they feared the Eldar and the light of their eyes, and then dissensions awoke among the Edain, in which the shadow of Morgoth may be discerned, for certain it is that he knew of the coming of man into Beleriand, and of their growing friendship with the elves. The leaders of discontent were Bereg of the house of Beor and Amlach, one of the grandsons of Marach, and they said openly, we took long roads, desiring to escape the perils of Middle-earth and the dark things that dwelt there, for we heard that there was light in the west. But now we learn that the light is beyond the sea. Thither we cannot come where the gods dwell in bliss, save one, for the Lord of the Dark is here before us, and the Eldar wise but fell, who make endless war upon him. In the north he dwells, they say, and there is the pain and death from which we fled. We will not go that way. Then a council and assembly of men was called, and great numbers came together. And the elf friends answered Beric, saying, "Truly, from the Dark King come all the evils which we fled. But he seeks dominion over all Middle-earth, and whither now shall we turn that he will not pursue us? Unless he be vanquished here, or at least held in leaguer, only by the valor of the Eldar is he restrained, and maybe it was for this purpose to aid them at need that we were brought into this land." So, many thousands of the men go into Beleriand, like distribute themselves all across Beleriand, but many more remain in Estelad. There's still a mingled people living there long years after, until in the ruin of Beleriand they were overwhelmed or fled back into the east, right? More foreshadowing of the incalculable destruction that will come. For beside the old who deemed that their wandering days were over, there were not a few who desired to go their own way. So we've got some who just are done wandering, and we've got some who don't want to pledge themselves to the Noldor. They want to do something else. They want to find their own path, and this causes friction. And it causes friction under the shadow of Morgoth, right? In which the shadow of Morgoth may be discerned. Now we have discord in the population of men here of the Edain here in Beleriand, and that is because of the presence by proxy, if you like, of Morgoth himself. And the leaders of these discontent, Beric of the house of Beor and Amlach of the grandsons of Marach, and they say openly, "We were told to come here because there is light in the west. Turns out, nuh-uh, or at least not here. Turns out that the light is across the sea and we can't go there. And the only thing that is here, by the way, is the Lord of Dark, is Morgoth himself. He's here. He's the author of all our woes. He is the guy who's brought all of this pain and destruction upon us. He is here, and we won't go north. We won't go and confront him. The only people here are the Eldar, wise but fell, who make endless war against him. So they call together a council, and many people come together, and the elf friends, right, like the allies, the pro-elven faction here among the Edain, say, yes, the Dark King, Morgoth, is the problem. All of the evils from which we fled come from him, and he seeks dominion over all Middle-earth. Whither now shall we turn, where he will not pursue us? He's not going to be satisfied hanging out here. Like, if you are scared of him, fight him. You can't hide from him, because eventually he's not going to stop until he's the ruler of everywhere. There's nowhere we can go that will ultimately escape his wrath, right? Unless he be vanquished here, or at least held in leaguer. This is the only way that we can have peace, is if he is imprisoned or vanquished. Only by the valor of the Eldar is he restrained, and maybe it was for this purpose, to aid them at need, that we were brought into this land. Maybe we've misunderstood, right? We thought that we were just coming to a place that was safe, but maybe we're instead coming to the front line, because this is how we preserve that safety. Maybe this is how we spend our strength, is in the service and in allyship with the elves, with the Eldar, who restrain Morgoth in Angband in the north. Is this sufficient? Well, let's look at the other half of this discord, of this council. To this Beric answered, "Let the Eldar look to it. Our lives are short enough." But there arose one who seemed all to be Amlach, son of Imlach, speaking fell words that shook the hearts of all who heard him. "All this is but elvish lore, tales to beguile newcomers that are unwary. The sea has no shore, there is no light in the west. You have followed a full fire of the elves to the end of the world. Which of you has seen the least of the gods? Who has beheld the Dark King in the north? Those who seek the dominion of Middle-earth are the Eldar. Greedy for wealth, they have delved in the earth for its secrets, and have stirred to wrath the things that dwell beneath it, as they have ever done and ever shall. Let the orcs have the realm that is theirs, and we will have ours. There is room in the world, if the Eldar will let us be." Then those that listened sat for a while, astounded, and a shadow of fear fell on their hearts, and they resolved to depart far from the lands of the Eldar. But afterwards Amlach returned among them, and denied that he had been present at their debate, or had spoken such words as they reported, and there was doubt and bewilderment among men. Then the elf friend said, "You will now believe this at least, that there is indeed a dark lord, and his spies and emissaries are among us, for he fears us, and the strength that we may give to his foes." But some still answered, "He hates us rather, and ever the more the longer we dwell here, meddling in his quarrel with the kings of the Eldar to no gain of ours." Many, therefore, of those that yet remained in Estelad made ready to depart, and Beric led 1,000 of the people of Beor away southwards, and they passed out of the songs of those days. But Amlach repented, saying, "I have now a quarrel of my own with this master of lies, which will last to my life's end." And he went away north and entered the service of Mithras. But those of his people who were of like mind with Beric chose a new leader, and they went back over the mountains into Eriador. and are forgotten. This is very quietly. It's so easy to miss it, right? It's so easy to get into the politics of this chapter. It's so easy to get caught up in this chain of names and adjectives and lose track of what is happening. But this, I don't think there's a moment like this in the Silmarillion. Nowhere else do we see the actual on-the-ground manifestation of Morgoth's campaign of lies and misinformation. Nowhere else do we get it so plainly, right? We're told about it. We're given an account of it. All the way back in Aman, we get the sense of Morgoth going among the Noldor and spreading his lies. But this is completely different because we get a reported dialogue. We get the actual impersonation of Amlach here, right? Amlach, grandson of Malach. As we're continuing the council here, Barrag answers, "Let the Eldar look to it, our lives are short enough." Okay, that's a pretty straightforward response, right? Okay, well, we're not going to waste our lives fighting Morgoth. The elves should do that. They live, let me check, forever. Maybe they can just pledge themselves to the Leaguer of Angband. That's not our job. But then we have Amlach, son of Imlach. Not Amlach, son of Imlach. One who seemed to all to be Amlach, son of Imlach, speaking fell words that shook the hearts of all who heard him. And note how carefully this kind of deconstructs our sense of how the world operates. But it is compelling. A long time ago, we talked about this aesthetic fascination that does not fit with his conception of how the world is ordered, right? This aesthetic fascination that Tolkien has with a kind of excessive cosmic horror, right? We talked about Ungoliant, and we talked about the dark things beneath Moria. We talked about the Watcher in the Water, and even to some extent the role of Durin's Bane during the Moria chapter of The Lord of the Rings. These things are in some way unknowable and uncountable, that there are things deeper and darker in the universe than the Ainur, right? Than either the Valar or the Maiar who came in at the moment of creation. This is not literally true. This is, everything is fairly carefully accounted for. We're told that these spirits are, are Maiar spirits who come in at that moment of creation. But it feels like they're not, right? It feels like Ungoliant is not a Maiar. It is not a Maiar, excuse me. It feels like Ungoliant is something else. It feels like the Watcher in the Water is something else. And look at what Melkor is doing. He's using this kind of narrative to sway the hearts of the men. Which of you has seen the least of the gods? Who has beheld the Dark King in the north? Those who seek the dominion of Middle-earth are the Eldar. Greedy for wealth, they have delved in the earth for all its secrets and have stirred to wrath the things that dwell beneath it, as they have ever done and ever shall. Oh, these monsters? Yeah, they don't come from Morgoth. Like there's a Dark King in an iron throne north of here someplace. Like as if. No, these are just monsters that live under the earth. Have you never heard of monsters that live under the earth? The Eldar have caused that. The elves have made them get all feisty because they have dug too deep. They have dug too greedily and too deep, right? This is a fantastic counterpoint to the schematic that we understand of Tolkien's Legendarium, of Arda at this point. But it fits so beautifully, aesthetically, that we have independently noted some of these conclusions that Morgoth is now, by proxy, suggesting, is propagandizing to the Edain of Beleriand. I think it's absolutely fantastic and extremely self-aware. Extremely self-aware. This is proof that Tolkien knows what he is doing, even in the most abstracted senses, right? From perspectives that are not themselves validated by the literal content of the text, but are validated by Tolkien's aesthetic choices. This is the proof that he knows that is happening. He's aware of the suggestions that are being made. He can see that readers are going to find Ungoliant to be unsettling and to be otherworldly, and to sit uncomfortably with the taxonomy that he has offered us as an accounting of all of the beings of Arda. No, there are things that even Tolkien is aware of and kind of sit outside of that, whether that be, Tom Bombadil or Durin's Bane or the Watcher in the Water or Ungoliant. Yeah. So that is all brilliant, right? The propaganda of Morgoth here. There are no gods in the West. Don't be ridiculous. You know who wants dominion over Middle-earth? The elves want dominion over Middle-earth. You know why? Because the ground is full of shiny rocks that they really, really like. They have caused this war with the orcs. Let the orcs have the land of the elves, and we will go and find our own lands. There is room in the world if the Eldar will let us be. And it works. Many sit ascended. A shadow of fear fell on their hearts, and they resolved to depart far from the lands of the Eldar. But afterwards, Amlach returns. And I didn't say any... I didn't get a bat. I don't even have a lanyard. I couldn't get into the council in the first place, let alone address everyone like it was, a conspiracy theorist TED talk. I have no idea what happened there. And I love Amlach repenting, right? I have now a quarrel of my own with this master of lies that will last to my life's end. And he went away north and entered the service of Maethros. Of course it's Maethros. He goes to the March of Maethros, which is, you'll remember, right, the most exposed point in the Leaguer, right? That the open march, the frontier land just south of Angband itself, that if Morgoth comes forth in force, he will hit first Maethros. So that's where Amlach goes to kind of persecute this righteous war, this personal... Morgoth showed up in their council and used his face, used his voice to argue these lies. So Amlach completely repents and undertakes this campaign instead. And you'll note here too the people passing out of the story. Bereg leads 1,000 of the people of Beor away southwards. They're out of the story. Those of his people who were of like mind with Bereg chose a new leader. They went back over the mountains into Eriador and are forgotten. We don't know them. I believe that there is... I should have looked this. I'm talking extemporaneously and without sufficient research here. I believe that somewhere in the extended material there is an accounting that these people who pass back into Eriador, back into Middle Earth proper, are the people of Gan. I'm trying to remember this as I speak, and I'm not getting there. So I will look up exactly where that is, and we will discuss it a little next week. If you remember the people of Gan, the wild men of the wood, who meet with Theoden King on the way to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. I should note too, Fool Fire here. You have followed a Fool Fire of the elves to the end of the world. I mean... This is fantastic. The sea has no shore. There is no light in the west. You have followed a fool fire of the elves to the end of the world. A will-o'-the-wisp is a fool fire, right? A glowing light said in fairy tales to lead you into trouble, right? Often associated with marshlight, yeah. Okay, we have, how many slides do we have left? We've got 6 slides left, and we're 20 minutes away from time. Let's persevere. Let's see if we can make it through this entire chapter. Just once it would be nice to finish the work that I have laid out for myself as we progress. During this time, the Haladin remained in Thargalion and were content. But Morgoth, seeing that by lies and deceits he could not yet wholly estrange elves and men, was filled with wrath and endeavoured to do man what hurt he could. Therefore he sent out an orc raid, and passing east it escaped the Leaguer, and came in stealth back over Eredlund by the passes of the Dwarf Road, and fell upon the Haladin in the southern woods of the land of Caranthir. Now the Haladin did not live under the rule of lords or many together, but each homestead was set apart and governed its own affairs, and they were slow to unite. But there was among them a man named Haldad, who was masterful and fearless, and he gathered all the brave men that he could find, and retreated to the angle of land between Ascar and Gallion, and in the utmost corner he built a stockade across from water to water, and behind it they led all the women and children that they could save. There they were besieged until their food was gone. Haldad had twin children, Haleth his daughter, and Haldar his son, and both were valiant in the defence, for Haleth was a woman of great heart and strength. But at last Haldad was slain in a sortie against the orcs, and Haldar, who rushed out to save his father's body from their butchery, was hewn down beside him. Then Haleth held the people together, though they were without hope, and some cast themselves into the rivers and were drowned. But 7 days later, as the orcs made their last assault and had already broken through the stockade, there came suddenly a music of trumpets, and Caranthir with his host came down from the north and drove the orcs into the rivers. So this is the second group. This is the second family who comes here into Beleriand, distinct from the House of Beor and the folk of Marach. This is the Haladin, who go to live, as we said, alongside Caranthir, not with Caranthir in the way that the other men are living with the elves in the service of the elves, alongside the elves. This is just, they happen to kind of cohabitate, right? They're just living near one another up here in the northeast. So Morgoth, seeing that his lies can only do so much and not really split the elves and men apart, just wants to hurt them, right? This is not part of his propaganda campaign. This is not part of his Machiavellian machinations here. He's just filled with wrath. So he sends out the raid. They passes east, kind of around the northern end of the Ered Luin, and then circles back, coming through the passes of the Dwarf Road, and falls upon the Haladin, in the southern woods of the land of Caranthir. And the Haladin are not martial. They do not have the same kind of structure that particularly the folk of Marach, right? We're told that the folk of Marach travel in like legions, right? They march together. They are very ordered and orderly. Well, that is not the way of the Haladin. They are scattered. They live in separate little homesteads, much like the elves did, if you recall, much like the Sindar, the elves of King Thingol did before the first battle of Beleriand, the unnamed battle of Beleriand. So crucially first, the Haladin do not have a king, but Haldad takes charge. He is masterful and fearless. He creates this fortification in this little angle between the river Askar and the river Gallian. He builds this stockade across it, right? He basically builds this rudimentary fortress, and they hold it. He, along with his children and as many good men and women as they can marshal there in time. Both Haleth and Haldar are valiant in the defense, for Haleth was a woman of great heart and strength. And I mentioned earlier that we were going to celebrate this week an underregarded champion of the men of Beleriand, right? Here she is. Haleth is great, and it's kind of real easy just to breeze past Haleth. It's kind of easy just to not really track with what is happening here, because we're telling this story very quickly and because we just have such a host of names to navigate here. But Haleth really stands out, right? A woman of great heart and strength. At last, Haldad, her father, is slain in a sortie against the orcs, and Haldar, her brother, rushes out to save her father's body from their butchery, is hewn down. Both her father and her brother killed in the same moment, in effect, and she alone is left in command. Haleth held the people together, though they were without hope, and some cast themselves into the rivers and were drowned, and she endures there for 7 days. Marshalling her people behind this wooden stockade, surviving. They are already without food. 7 days pass. The orcs make their last assault. They have broken the stockade, and then we hear the trumpets of Caranthir, right? Obviously, we're getting Helm's Deep. Obviously, we're getting, right, a kind of, again, a familiar recapitulation of events that will happen thousands of years later, of course, right? If you can recapitulate events that have not yet happened. But we're seeing again some of this typology. We're seeing again some of the similarities here unfolding in the works of Professor Tolkien. I love this. I think it really stands out here. Let's talk about Haleth becoming the chief. Then Caranthir looked kindly upon men and did Haleth great honour, and he offered her recompense for her father and brother. And seeing overlate what valour there was in the Edain, he said to her, "If you will remove and dwell further north, there you shall have the friendship and protection of the Eldar and free lands of your own." But Haleth was proud and unwilling to be guided or ruled, and most of the Haladin were of like mood. Therefore she thanked Caranthir, but answered, "My mind is now set, Lord, to leave the shadow of the mountains and go west, whither others of our kin have gone." When therefore the Haladin had gathered all whom they could find alive of their folk who had fled wild into the woods before the orcs, and had gleaned what remained of their goods in their burned homesteads, they took Haleth for their chief, and she led them at last to Estelad, and there dwelt for a time. So Caranthir is moved, right? The second Feanorist son of Feanor is moved by their valor. Seeing overlate what valor there was in the Edain, he actually offers her space in his lands. And not just service, right? If you remove and dwell further north, there you shall have the friendship and protection of the Eldar and free lands of your own. This isn't just, hey, you guys can really fight. Holy smokes, come and join my army. No, this is, you guys are amazing. Come live in my lands where you can still be free, and I will promise you friendship and protection. But Haleth doesn't want to play that game. Her people, the Haladin, don't want to play that game. They don't want to be guided. They don't want to be ruled. She wants to be free. So she thanks Caranthir and says, nope, we are going to head out west. So they gather their people together. They gather what supplies they can, which you'll note, right, does not include extra provision from Caranthir. We're not getting the sense here that the elves are materially helping the survivors of this awful assault of orcs. Then they take Haleth for their chief, presumably the first time that they have had such a chief, and she leads them to Estelad. Haleth is just fantastic. But they remained a people apart, and were ever after known to elves and men as the people of Haleth. Haleth remained their chief while her days lasted, but she did not wed, and the headship afterwards passed to Haldan, son of Haldar, her brother. Soon, however, Haleth desired to move westward again, and though most of her people were against this counsel, she led them forth once more, and they went without help or guidance of the Eldar, and passing over Kellon and Aros, they journeyed in the perilous land between the mountains of Terror and the girdle of Melian. That land was even then not yet so evil as it after became, but it was no road for mortal men to take without aid, and Haleth only brought her people through it with hardship and loss, constraining them to go forward by the strength of her will. At last they crossed over the Brithiach, and many bitterly repented of their journey, but there was now no returning. Therefore in new lands they went back to their old life as best they could, and they dwelt in free homesteads in the woods of Talathdyrn and beyond Maeglin, and some wandered far into the realm of Nargothrond. But there were many who loved the Lady Haleth, and wished to go whither she would, and dwell under her rule, and these she led into the forest of Brethil between Maeglin and Sirion. Thither in the evil days that followed many of her scattered folk returned. So they go to Estelad, right, the encampment, but that land is also not their own land. So they undertake this, basically unprecedented journey. And if you want to see this as being a recapitulation of the crossing of the Helcaraxa, I think that you can. I don't think that you're completely unjustified in seeing a kind of echo here too. She passes between the mountains of Terror and the girdle of Melian, right? This is bad territory. This is dangerous. And though it's not as bad as it's going to be, still, it's absolutely clear, right? It was no road for mortal men to take without aid. And Haleth only brought her people through it with hardship and loss, constraining them to go forward by the strength of her will. Who among us, right? Who among us could even attempt such a thing? She is the peer, I think, of any of the great women of Tolkien's Legendarium. I absolutely have to race because I've only got 10 more minutes and we've got, what do we have? 3 more slides. Let's finish the story of Haleth for sure here. Now Brethil was claimed as part of his realm by King Thingol, that was not within the girdle of Melian, and he would have denied it to Haleth. But Felagund, who had the friendship of Thingol, hearing of all that had befallen the people of Haleth, obtained this grace for her, that she would dwell free in Brethil upon the condition only that her people would guard the crossings of Maeglin against all enemies of the Eldar and allow no orcs to enter their woods. To this Haleth answered, "Where are Haldad my father and Haldar my brother? If the king of Doriath fears a friendship between Haleth and those who have devoured her kin, then the thoughts of the Eldar are strange to men." And Haleth dwelt in Brethil until she died, and her people raised a green mound over her in the heights of the forest, Tur Haretha, the Lady Barrow, Hauth en Arwen in the Sindarin tongue. In this way it came to pass that the Edain dwelt in the lands of the Eldar, some here, some there, some wandering, some settled in kindreds or small peoples, and the most part of them soon learned the grey elven tongue, both as common speech among themselves and because they were eager to learn the lore of the elves. But after a time, the elf kings, seeing that it was not good for elves and men to dwell mingled together without order, and that men needed lords of their own kind, set regions apart where men could live their own lives, and appointed chieftains to hold these lands freely. Yet, they were the allies of the Eldar in war, but marched under their own leaders. Yet many of the Edain had delight in the friendship of the elves, and dwelt among them for so long as they had leave, and the young man often took service for a time in the hosts of the kings. So let's complete the story here of Haleth. Technically, Brethil is a part of King Thingol's realm, and he has already said that he's not super into this idea of there being men in Beleriand. I mean, ew, who would want that? But Felagund speaks on behalf of Haleth and her people too, pointing out all that they have endured and gets this grace, right? Thingol says, okay, fine. She can live there, her people can live there, but they have to guard the crossing of Maeglin against all the enemies of the Eldar. Allow no orcs to enter their woods. To which Haleth says, don't you know me at all? Do you see who I am? Do you see what I have endured? Where is Haldad my father and Haldar my brother? If the king of Doriath fears a friendship between Haleth and those who have devoured her kin, then the thoughts of the Eldar are strange to men. Of course, I'm going to defend my kingdom, my area here of Beleriand. Of course, I am going to suffer no orc to cross the Maeglin and to enter the woods. And in the end, she is respected by her people, is praised by her people, is remembered by her people, who raise a green mound over her in the heights of the forest, Tur Haretha, the Lady Barrow, right? And then we get this really interesting and provocative bit of Sindarin here, Hauth en Arwen in the Sindarin tongue. Arwen Arwen of Rivendell, Arwen of being married to Aragorn fame, simply lady, like technically like noble maiden is the literal translation there of Arwen. But yeah, Arwen is just the Sindarin in effect for lady. Capital L lady, at least, yeah. All of this then takes us to the begatting. As I said, I was critical of Chapter 14 of Beleriand and its realms, but this is the most concentrated begatting that we're going to get. And then we're going to have we're going to have a couple more slides. Oh boy. Let's wrap it up. I can be late. Let's just wrap it up and we'll persevere here, shall we? So this is the begatting. Watch out for the name, which seems unlike the others. Now Hador Lorindal, son of Hathor, son of Magor, son of Malach Aradan, entered the household of Fingolfin in his youth and was loved by the king. Fingolfin therefore gave him the lordship of Dor Loman, and into that land he gathered most of the people of his kin and became the mightiest of the chieftains of the Edain. In his house only the elven tongue was spoken, but their own speech was not forgotten, and from it came the common tongue of Numenor. But in Dorthonion, the lordship of the people of Beor in the country of Ladros was given to Boromir, son of Boron, who was the grandson of Beor the Old. The sons of Hador were Galdor and Gundor, and the sons of Galdor were Hurin and Huror, and the son of Hurin was Turin, the bane of Glaurung, and the son of Huor was Tuor, father of Eärendil the Blessed. The son of Boromir was Bregor, whose sons were Bregolas and Barahir, and the sons of Bregolas were Baragund and Belegund. The daughter of Baragund was Morwen, the mother of Turin, and the daughter of Belegund was Rian, the mother of Tuor. But the son of Barahir was Beren One-Hand, who won the love of Luthien Thingol's daughter and returned from the dead, and from them came Elwing, the wife of Eärendil, and all the kings of Numenor after. So, yes, a little bit of begatting. Yes, some familiar names that have already been teased here. Certainly, Eärendil showing up again is always welcome. We get the explicit mention here of Beren One-Hand, and incidentally, the spoiling of his story, right? Beren One-Hand, who won the love of Luthien Thingol's daughter and returned from the dead. Oh, that's how that story goes. Okay, cool. We get, obviously, Hurin and Turin here. We get Tuor, who will also be talking about in the pages to come. What we have to understand here, I suppose the other thing that I want to pull out before we really just get to the status quo here, what really stands out at this point is the creation of Adonaic, right? Was it last week or maybe even the week before, Galadriel in the chat had the question about the language of Gondor, right? And the influence of the elven tongue there. Is it Sindarin or is it Quenya that really influences Gondor? It's Sindarin, because Sindarin is here fused with the primitive language of the man of the East into what we will come to know, the common tongue of Numenor as it's presented here, what we will come to know as Adonaic. This is where that fusion takes place in Dor Loman here, in the land of Hador Lorindal, son of Hathor, son of Magor, son of Malach Aradan. The move here to first unify and then to kind of compartmentalize the allied children of Iluvatar, I find really interesting. Obviously, we're feeling a historical pressure here, right? A mythologically historical, right? There's a sense here in which we don't want to unify men and elves because, mythologically speaking, the elves aren't going to stick around. The elves aren't going to make it out of this mythological framework into our real life recorded history, right? There aren't a lot of elves kicking around in ancient Rome, for example, or ancient Egypt, right? We don't know, again, speculatively at least, right? The man will tell you that there were no elves kicking around in ancient Rome, for sure. It's 2025, you guys. Who knows what will be revealed next? But this is part of Tolkien wanting to preserve a uniquely human identity for the men of Beleriand who will, as is now becoming clear, right, who are going to become Numenorians, who are going to be, we're by degrees getting closer and closer to peoples we understand, populations we understand, individuals that we understand. As I said, which name jumps out at us here? Boromir. Of course, Boromir jumps out at us here. That is a name that is going to be renewed. Interestingly, we've already had, as I mentioned, our Denethor, right? The leader of those Teleri who will become the Lyquendi following his death. We've already had our Denethor, and now we have our first Boromir. And we're charting the family trees here as we move forward. Okay, let's take a quick look at the Doom of the Noldor, And then we can kind of recap exactly where we are vis-a-vis men in Beleriand. All these were caught in the net of the doom of the Noldor. And they did great deeds, which the Eldar remember still among the histories of the kings of old. And in those days the strength of men was added to the power of the Noldor, and their hope was high, and Morgoth was straitly enclosed. For the people of Hador, being hardy to endure cold and long wandering, feared not at times to go far into the north, and there keep watch upon the movements of the enemy. The men of the three houses throve and multiplied, but greatest among them was the house of Hador Goldenhead, peer of elven lords. His people were of great strength and stature, ready in mind, bold and steadfast, quick to anger and laughter, mighty among the children of Iluvatar and the youth of mankind. Yellow-haired they were for the most part, and blue-eyed. But not so was Turin, whose mother was Morwen of the house of Beor. The men of that house were dark or brown of hair with grey eyes, and of all men they were most like to the Noldor and most loved by them, for they were eager of mind, cunning-handed, swift in understanding, long in memory, and they were moved sooner to pity than to laughter. Like to them were the woodland folk of Haleth, and they were of lesser stature and less eager for lore. They used few words and did not love great concourse of men, and many among them delighted in solitude, wandering free in the greenwoods, while the wonder of the lands of the Eldar was new upon them. But in the realms of the west their time was brief, and their days unhappy. More foreshadowing here of Turin Turambar, who we will talk about in chapter 21, 4 weeks from now, I guess. That's the fourth of our really big chapters that we're going to be talking about in the episodes to come. If you have not yet heard the story of Turambar, buckle up. That one's a tough one. So we have here basically, right, our three houses. We have the house of Beor. These are the dark-haired, gray-eyed, right? These are the ones that most resemble the Noldor. These are the ones that are most beloved of the Noldor. Eager of mind, cunning-hearted, swift in understanding, long in memory, moved sooner to pity than to laughter, right? We're already getting like a little bit of like the sadness and grace of the elves coming in here, right? We're getting some sense of that group here. We're also see here the Halidin, the house of Haleth, right? The reclusive folk, dark-haired, smaller in stature than the house of Beor. And of course, we have the folk of Marach, those who come in under the leadership of Marach, best known as the house of Hador here. Hador Goldenhead, peer of elven lords. His people were of great strength and stature, ready in mind, bold and steadfast, quick to anger and to laughter, mighty among the children of Iluvatar and the youth of mankind. Yellow-haired they were for the most part, right? Not Turin. He gets his coloring from his mother's side, but mostly they are, golden-haired, ready to laugh. These are like Norse warriors. That's the sense that we're getting here. These are of that kindred. And of course, it's impossible for me personally, having loved so much his presence in the book, it's impossible not to recognize some aspect of Tukas here, right? Who we have to remember, like, isn't dead. Like, Tukas hasn't left the story. He's just not mentioned anymore. He is presumably still out in Valinor organizing some kind of professional wrestling league. I say this, of course, because this weekend, here on Easter weekend of 2025, it is also WrestleMania happening in Las Vegas. So I can only imagine that Tukas is loving that experience too. So these are our various houses of men, which are going to become so important as we move forward. Let's cover this last slide and then we'll get out of here. The years of the Edain were lengthened according to the reckoning of man after their coming to Beleriand, but at last Beor the Old died when he had lived 93 years, for 44 of which he had served King Felgund. And when he lay dead of no wound or grief, but stricken by age, the Eldar saw for the first time the swift waning of the life of man, and the death of weariness which they knew not in themselves. And they grieved greatly for the loss of their friends. But Beor at the last had relinquished his life willingly and passed in peace, and the Eldar wondered much at the strange fate of man, for in all their lore there was no account of it, and its end was hidden from them. Nonetheless, the Edain of old learned swiftly of the Eldar all such art and knowledge as they could receive, and their sons increased in wisdom and skill until they far surpassed all others of mankind, who dwelt still east of the mountains and had not seen the Eldar, nor looked upon the faces that had beheld the light of Valinor. So here, as we've discussed before, we've already taken account, as it were, of the the ignorance of the elves regarding the ultimate fate of man, right? The elves don't understand what happens to man. They don't really understand how men interact with the world because they have a fundamentally different relationship. Elves are of the world and men are not. But this is where the rubber of that speculation meets the road of friendship, right? Beor serves King Felagund for 40 years. He dies at the age of 93, and he dies willingly. He dies even eagerly, right? He passes in peace. Beor at the last had relinquished his life willingly and passed in peace. And the Eldar wondered much at the strange fate of men, for in all their lore there was no account of it, and its end was hidden from them. They don't know what happens next to men. They don't know if men have like a Halls of Mandos all their own, or some subset of the Halls of Mandos that they themselves would recognize. But they are also baffled by this willing giving up of life. They haven't seen it. The Eldar saw for the first time the swift waning of the life of man and the death of weariness, which they knew not in themselves, right? They haven't seen aging in this way. The closest thing to this that we have seen is Miriel Cindere, the mother of Feanor, who is so drained of life that she goes to lay down in the gardens of Lorien and departs her body, right? That is probably the closest thing in elven experience, and that's a one-shot deal, right? That only happens once that we know of, and isn't really the same thing. It's not quite, because in her grief, she departs her body. In her draining, she departs her body. But it's not with this willingness that we see here from Beor. The elves don't understand what is happening. And of course, what we're really doing here is landing the symmetry, right? The elves go into the West and learn of the Valar, and the men come into the West and learn of the elves. And in much the same way, they are embiggened. They are ennobled by this association, right? The elves go into the West and the light of Valinor forever shines in their faces. Well, there's no light of Valinor in the faces of the men who come into Beleriand and live alongside the elves here, live alongside the Noldor in particular here. But there is an improvement. There is, an increase, right? Their sons increased in wisdom and skill until they far surpassed all others of mankind who dwelt still east of the mountains and had not seen the Eldar, nor looked upon the faces that had beheld the light of Valinor. There is this same process of becoming greater, thanks to the proximity of others who are functionally greater. And that, believe it or not, takes us somewhat hurriedly. I will probably circle around at the beginning of next week to come back. If you have any questions about what we've read this week, then please do get in touch and let me know. We're also coming up, I guess, on another Q&A session. So if you have questions about this material that I haven't covered with sufficient thoroughness, then please do get in touch and let me know. Let's take a quick look at our final slide here. We made it to our final slide, you guys. Looking ahead to our schedule, April 24th, back to Thursday. I know that I said this week we will be back on Thursday. You would not believe the degree to which my personal schedule has fallen apart over the course of the last couple of weeks. We are really scrambling to make space for these live broadcasts, but we will continue to do it. And this Thursday looks absolutely solid. I can tell you it will be later. It will be 9 p.m. Central Time. It will be an hour later than our usual slot. That will, as far as I can manage it, be our regular slot from this point on. Thursday at 9 p.m. Central. So April 24th, we're going to look at Chapter 18 of the Quenta Silmarillion on the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. This is Fingolfin's absolute rock star moment. It is a really great, kinetic, active chapter. Just things fall apart in this reading. It's going to be really great. And then the following week, May 1st, can you believe that we're already looking ahead to the 1st of May, Chapter 19 of Beren and Luthien. Obviously, one of the great stories of Tolkien's Legendarium, one of the most effective encapsulations of so much of Tolkien's belief, right? There's so much of what is true of how Tolkien sees the world, particularly through the lens of his secondary creation, that is encapsulated in this one single story. It is a real Rosetta Stone for understanding so much of what Tolkien believes to be true, and it is really informative of the rest of our reading. That will take us through the next 2 weeks, and from there, we've got in total, I think, 7 chapters of the Quenta left, including the 2 that we're going to cover. And the next week, we're going to close out with of course, Eärendil, closing out the Quenta. Then we're going to do a week on the Akallabeth and Numenor. Then we're going to do a week on the Rings of Power and the Third Age. Obviously, we could spend a lot more time looking at those chapters, but I don't want to spend too much time looking at those chapters because we have other adventures and we will have other opportunities to talk about those stories. That means that we're penciled in to begin the new, I'm saying this very hesitantly because you know how schedules are. You can see, my God, how schedules are. But we are scheduled to begin the new ongoing Tolkien show that will be a completely separate podcast. More on that information in the weeks to, more information about that new show in the weeks to come. We're going to begin that new show, and we're going to begin our Jane Austen unit on Sense and Sensibility probably the last week of June. That is now looking pretty concrete. That is now looking pretty firm. Between here and there, I'm also going to try and squeeze in a bonus episode on Martha Wells's fantastic All Systems Red, the first of the Murderbot Diaries, just to really change up the pace, right? What sits more companionably alongside Professor Tolkien on one side and Jane Austen on the other than Martha Well's Murderbot Diaries? We're going to talk about the first novella. That is a really fast read. It's really accessible, but also enormously provocative. It is a very thoughtful book that never kind of takes its foot off the gas of characterization and personality and humor and wit. It's very accessible. It's also very thought-provoking. I'm really looking forward to having a bonus episode dedicated entirely to that first book in the Murderbot Diaries series. That will be a Patreon-exclusive bonus episode. What's Patreon, you ask? Patreon? Never heard of it, Precious? Well, you can head over to patreon.com/nextword, where you can join up for free. For example, you can just follow that page for free, and you'll get the link every week to these live sessions here on YouTube. You can also pledge a little financial support that will get you access to just a ton of bonus episodes. If you really have a pressing need to listen to something like 80 hours of my voice within the next week, you can find that over on the Patreon page. You guys, you can head on over there. You can get all of those bonus episodes. You can get our Patreon exclusive weekly show that we put out every Monday evening, usually quite late on a Monday evening, called Made It Through Monday, where Elizabeth and I drink a cocktail and talk about all of the culture and art that we have appreciated in that week. The TV shows, the movies, the books, the music. Last week was a tough week, so we ended up just talking a lot and playing a game about Grey's Anatomy, of all things. This week, upcoming, we're going to be talking about the career of Josh Duhamel, among other things. If you know Tad Hamilton, maybe some of us once tried to win a date with Tad Hamilton in a really weird and mostly bad movie that is nevertheless really fun to talk about. We're going to be talking about the career of Josh Duhamel, of all things, this week on the show, and lots more besides. So, bonus episodes, entry to the Discord, and of course, your direct financial encouragement for me to continue making as many podcasts as a man can make in the span of a single week. That is going to do it for this week's show. I hope you'll be able to join me for the discussion of The Ruin of Beleriand on Thursday night. That's going to be a really fun discussion. And as ever, thank you so much for your support. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, take care. Thanks, guys. Good night.